This podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners and viewers like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The handle, The Beirut Banyan. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And to stay updated with video releases, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching. I'm Rani Shatar, and this is The Beirut Banyan. Wednesday night, I had the privilege of doing an episode with Rawi Haj. If you haven't heard of him, read his books. He has a terrific book called De Niro's Game, which came out in 2006. A more recent book, which is what I wanted to talk to him about, Beirut Hellfire Society, which came out in 2018. The episode turned into his story and what he saw changing in Ashrafiyye in the 1960s and 1970s. It's a story that I'm not too familiar with. But after the episode ended, he hopped on my electric scooter and I took this author for a little ride throughout his childhood. Shaitewi, Rmed, Jemezi, Marim Khayr, all the way up to Sessin, and we spent about 2 hours with him pointing at his life as it changed fundamentally. During the episode, he acknowledged that this book, I think, is the backbone to this discussion tonight. It's about a part of Lebanon that's nearly extinct. How he defines that word, I think, is how we're going to debate tonight, politely. He thinks of it as two things, and I think it's actually divided into here: a cosmopolitanism that's on the decline, and a community that's facing what he thinks of as potential extinction. And I think it was the best way to think through tonight's episode. So that's Wednesday night. Let me take you back now 20 years ago.
Okay.
Where is Sarmad Salibi? Is he here? There he is. He's in the back. Is that him waving? Could we give a round of applause to this gentleman, Sarmad Salibi? I met Sarmad 20 years ago. I was looking for a cheap room to rent, and I found a room.
They kicked you out of the house?
Later.
Okay.
Actually, I'll get to that.
Yeah.
I was looking for affordable rent to go to AUB and live a student lifestyle. And I wandered up Sadet Street, just past Makhfer Hbesh, and to the right was a store called We Set, and dangling were the remains of a pizza store that once was there. And on the first and second floor were a bunch of foreigners and local students living in shared accommodation, 12 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 2 kitchens, a rooftop, the only pension that was opened in Beirut those days, what now we would consider a hostel. I helped my way in, and thanks to Sarmad, I had the best years of my life. That building is gone. Nadim, you're right. It was knocked down in 2009. Old rent issues, property dispute. But those 6 years, I think, defined the way I see Lebanon. And in 2008, during the street battles in Hamra, all of us were hiding under music instruments, left behind from a former music school, Lebanese foreigners ducking for cover under a grand piano. When there were gunshots outside, there was a sniper shooting at us at the roof. We were hiding together. And I think it's either the week or 2 weeks after that, Sarmad showed up, checking on us, making sure we're fine. And he introduced me to a man that I think defines Lebanese history. He introduced me to Kamal Salibi. Everyone knows this book, A House of Many Mansions. Sarmad took me with him to Kamal Salibi's home, and the first thing he said to me, "Are you related to Hassan Shatah?" is the only person in this country who's ever referred to an uncle rather than my father. And I said, how the hell do you know Hassan Shadah? He's a student at AUB, a member of Kataib.
Oh, yes.
The only Muslim, I think, in Kataib.
I know a couple more, yeah.
You know a couple of more. Okay, so there's...
Both called Hassan, actually.
That's the same Hassan. And this man was not shy about it. In the 1960s, an AUB student from Tripoli, brandishing his Kataib credentials. That wasn't throughout the family, that was just him. And Sarmad Salibi taught him. And after that, he pointed to a framed birth certificate, the Khraj Eid, and he said, look. And there was a line dashed through what should be your sect. There was no sect there.
Yeah.
And he emphasized that he did this. It's his doing. And actually, it's the first time I think I ever saw something like that. And that's some 15 years ago. And it stuck with me that a man who wrote about power sharing and communal harmony, and really the modern history of Lebanon, could also be secular at his core and want that removed. Those years, I actually met someone else. Very, very briefly. This is a brick. It's not a book. It's 600 pages. It weighs a lot. Samir Asir. I met him briefly at the Prague, actually right before he died. And I was reading a book about Lebanese history in Sessin when he was killed. And I think that moment changed my life. That's when I became enamored in Beirut's story. I learned a lot from this book. I learned a lot from his politics, his very eloquent way of describing a problem we live through today. He's the reason I started my old Walk Beirut tour. He's the reason I was inspired to pick up from where someone like this left off. And he shaped me in many different ways. People often ask me, why are you still here? And they assume it's my father. No, it's this man. It's what he left behind. So that book stayed with me. AUB, I stayed in Ras Beirut. I eventually moved to Ashrafi.
Why are you looking at me?
I eventually moved to Ashrafi. Wouldn't you take it personally if I didn't? Oh, there they are. I meant I stayed in Ras Beirut. And now I live in Rawi Hajj in his mind, in his childhood. And I feel slightly more comfortable in his memory than I do in the Ras Beirut of today, which means things are changing. This is really the backbone, I think, to the conversation. We see a similar problem. I think we have different ways of looking at it through narrative. Maybe we don't have the same solutions moving forward, but there is something that's missing and it's on the decline. And we may well witness its extinction. What that word is, we'll get into today. Nadim Shehadi is a friend, a frequent writer to Arab News, recently the executive director of LAU in New York. I met you in Boston when you were at Tufts. I think I met you when you were still at Chatham House for the first time. And we've become friendly over the years. Nadim holds the record. This will be your 7th appearance on this podcast.
Okay.
Hicham Bou Nassif. Academically, I won't get too deep into your accomplishments, although you have published, not necessarily on the subject we're going to discuss tonight, but you're an accomplished author. Is it McKinnon?
Claremont McKenna.
Claremont McKenna University, tenured.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, and on sabbatical.
Yes.
And thanks to that sabbatical, you've become part of the story. This is a subject, I think, that was left to the margins, unfortunately and unfairly. It's an academic like yourself that can help shape it, explain it, and you become a household name. So this is a subject that I want to dive deep into. But let's start with the background. AUB, Ras Beirut, Kaslik, Mount Lebanon.
Indiana University.
Indiana University, Chatham House, the UK, America. There is, I think, a background that has not been explored. And allow me to start with you, Nadim. I think Ras Beirut still defines you, even when Ras Beirut is no longer Ras Beirut. And I've learned a lot from the way you describe your interpretation of many words: sectarianism, secularism, Ottoman cosmopolitanism, everything we've discussed before. But is it fair to say that your initial years and your experience in Ras Beirut and AUB is really the foundation for the way you see things moving forward? Is that the backbone to where you are right now? When you write in Arab news, when you sometimes show up on TV, when you talk to me, is that something that is still in you many, many decades later?
I mean, it applies to everybody. I mean, your childhood is your formative years. It's up to, I think, you're formed by the place you've lived in till the age of 17. But I want to comment on your description of the change. The whole world changes in 40 years. So to bring it to preempt a bit of what you're distinguishing between Ras Beirut and Mount Lebanon and Ashrafiyya and all that and Kaslik, I don't think they can exist without each other. So Ras Beirut, as it was, which is a cosmopolitan secular place where people mixed very naturally, could not have existed if there was no Ashrafiyya and Dahye and Tariq Jdide and it's the way cities in the Mediterranean and in the Ottoman world operated. You had quarters. You had a Jewish quarter, a Turkish quarter, an Armenian quarter, a Maronite quarter, Albanians, Europeans, you name it. And everyone felt some sort of security in their quarters when they went back there at night. And they interacted very naturally in the middle, in the Ras Beirut of these cities, where people interact naturally. And the interaction is a bit of hypocrisy, is a bit of, they're different people when they interact in the city. And when there is tension, that's when you have sectarianism. People are not sectarian or not sectarian. And you're not either or. Right? If there is tension, people regroup to their quarter where they feel secure, where they have protective boundaries, and that preserves the peace in a way. So Ras Beirut flourished as long as the boundaries in the rest of the country were safe, and sectarianism was not that pronounced. So that there's an interaction. It's not like a separate area.
In your mind, when you're writing today, even when it's not directly about Lebanon only, let's say you're focusing on the region and changes in the region, does AUB and Ras Beirut still fit into your writing?
Well, yes. I mean, AUB, certainly. I mean, I was in America for 7 years, and I wrote a piece that American-Arab relations is not Donald Trump meeting Abdel Fattah Sisi. American-Arab relations is American missionaries coming to Beirut almost exactly 200 years ago, when America itself was less than 40 years old, and they were half of it were savages. I mean, California wasn't even part of it, and they learned from us as much as we learned from them. And the interaction between Americans and the whole Arab world is through that process rather than the politics we have since World War II, if you like, which has changed. Yeah.
So I'll segue over to Hicham by saying that, for better or worse, I'm a product of the same thing. Meaning, I grew up in Hamra. I went to AUB. I studied there, got my master's degree there. I lived there. My mom still lives there. Even when I don't feel at ease in every part of Hamra or Ras Beirut the way I once did, I still think of it as home, for better or worse. Even the podcast's name is a tribute to the trees of AUB, the trees of knowledge, the banyan trees. And what drew me to someone like Samir Asir was his complexity. Meaning, he wrote in French, in Arabic. He was, I think, Syrian and Palestinian. A Christian who was comfortable among leftists in West Beirut. And someone who could actually fit into March 14 without shame. And I like that. I like the layers and the complexities within him. And I think that's kind of where I find myself, always holding on to something, knowing that it's on the decline. In your childhood, is there anything in that story, let's say, that doesn't fit into the way you grew up here?
I mean, I'm from the Shuf, and if we're going to talk about my childhood, we'll have to talk about one of the most violent episodes of the Lebanese civil war, just Harb al-Jabal. We are here in Hamdoun, or next to Hamdoun. Yeah. So my childhood was very much defined by Harb al-Jabal, because I went through Hisar Deir al-Amar, 100 days of really difficult, probably the most difficult 100 days in the history of contemporary Lebanon, certainly in the history of the civil war, where the Christians were actually cleansed from the Shuf, and they ended up in Deir al-Amar for 100 days, and then they had to leave the Shuf completely, and they became refugees in their own land. So no, I mean, there is not a lot of cosmopolitan dimension in that story. It's more, if we're talking about my childhood, it's a story about a young person opening up to life against the backdrop of ethnic cleansing, because that's Harb al-Jabal, ethnic cleansing happening for the second time in 120 years. So there's nothing rosy about that experience. But then again, I'll have to say that I feel you are a bit romanticizing and essentializing Hamra, because Hamra is also the place, for instance, where Hizb al-Sur al-Qawmi al-Ijtimai grew as an organization. And if there's one party we can call proto-fascist, that would be it, and that's Hamra as well. AUB is the place where Anton Saadi taught German to people. So Hamra is not only defined by cosmopolitanism, just as Mount Lebanon is not the ultra Maronite castle or like the ultra, I don't know, Druze castle that you think of it. There are a lot of people that, I mean, there's a lot of interaction between communities, opening up to the world that happened in and because of Mount Lebanon. And there's a lot of political extremism that came out of Hamra. So this Mount Lebanon versus Hamra thing that you seem to be doing, and it's not convincing to me. So this is one dimension. The other dimension, which I find...
Nice, Hicham. Be nice. This is the first 10 minutes. I've already... What have I done? I've romanticized. I've put things in bleak, black and white.
Yeah, I mean...
because you're ideological. I remember that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think... So I'm seriously. I mean, George Habash studied in AUB. Wadi Haddad studied. I mean, Wadi Habab was a terrorist. A lot of political extremism, a lot of anti-Lebanese ideologies grew or flourished in Hamra. And that's not good even from a liberal perspective, because I feel Lebanon as an experiment had a lot of liberal aspects to it. So the destruction of Lebanon was a disaster for modernity in the Levant, for liberalism in the Levant, and lots of that came from Hamra, whereas lots of opening up to new languages, opening up to Europe, opening up came from Mount Lebanon. So this Mount Lebanon versus Hamra thing you're doing, I find very questionable from a historical perspective. Let me just disagree with that.
Hold on, I have to interrupt.
Yeah,
because you've already asserted certain things that are not true.
Okay,
I'm not questioning. I'm actually trying to learn.
Yeah, okay.
So there's no prejudice towards Mount Lebanon.
Yeah,
or there's no favoritism. It's really how somebody grows up.
Yeah.
So they're not saying Mount Lebanon. We're doing this in Hamdoun.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I love Hamdoun. No, there's no question. Let me ask it in a way that maybe you won't take it. I'm not making it personal. It's trying to understand the foundation.
Yeah.
What you're saying is all true. There's nothing incorrect in terms of the names you mentioned, or even the parties that are very, very pathetic today.
Yeah.
Let me rescue you.
Can you, wait,
You're
let me
digging
rescue
yourself
you.
into a
You
hole.
already need rescuing.
Let me rescue myself, then you rescue me.
Okay.
All right. But there's, I think back to AUB
Yeah.
as that is not the mainstream. So let me give you an example. Before my time, one of the best stories I've read about AUB and Ras Beirut, by extension, I think it's the third chapter of a book called Dream Palace of the Arabs.
Yeah, of course. Fouad Chehab.
Right. There's a story about a poet,
Great guy.
Khalil Hawi,
Khalil Hawi.
Yeah.
who's Ras Beiruti and goes to AUB.
He's from Durshwe.
He's an SSNP member, and he's a Lebanese nationalist. He supports the Palestinians, he supports the Americans, he supports, I think, every side of the story, ends up killing himself.
Of course.
So the suicide of that individual, I think, is also part of the story, meaning that complicated person, to me, is not a bad person. It's somebody trying to find his way. And AUB, if you go back in time, this could be just an age thing. Nadim, I think you're 20 years older than me, or maybe a little more. You're in your late 60s. now?
I thought you were not going to bring this up.
You're in your 40s. Hicham, you're in your 40s.
I'm at early 20s.
Early 20s? That makes sense, yeah. So I'm the oldest one on stage. That the Hamra, I think Nadim refers to something I don't know. I'm too young to have known it.
Yeah.
But my reading of it, my understanding of it, is that AUB produced more good than bad. And I don't think Ras Beirut...
So I agree with that, of course.
Yeah, so, and you can think of all the other people that graduated from AUB that are shining stars. So I don't know if... I'm not trying to polarize or divide. It's more like where you see, and you said it up front, ethnic cleansing. That's your childhood. So that to me, it's actually...
That's Harb al-Jabal that I lived as a child, correct.
But I was thinking more of, let's say, even education or where you went to university. Did I get it right that it's at USEC?
Well, I did finish...
Before leaving to the US, I meant.
Well, I studied law at... I finished my doctorate in law at USEC.
Okay.
But in the meantime, I was studying political science at USG. And this is when I discovered that, I'm married to law, but I'm in love with political science. So I decided to basically jump ship after finishing the doctorate degree. And then I went to the States for the PhD.
Oh, so it started in San Jose and then finished in the US?
The political science side of my education, absolutely.
Okay.
But so Kaslik is just one place, because I also, my master's degree in law was at Sagesse.
I see.
You see, so there are a lot of places I studied in, and then... But you're focusing on Kaslik, and I
thought you said. I thought maybe that was during the war. That maybe there was some link to Kaslik.
The war. When the war finished, I was 12. So I wasn't in university during the war. The war ended. I was still not even in high school.
And you spent most of your childhood in one place, when you said the ethnic cleansing and.
Well, so I was born in the Shuf in 1978, and the Harb al-Jabal happened in 1983. And so in September 1983, Harb al-Jabal was at its height.
Yeah.
And essentially, this is when the Christians of Halay and the Shuf basically were kicked out. Of course, they were not kicked out automatically. They were first besieged at Deir al-Amr, at least those who made it to Deir al-Amr. Many did not, unfortunately. And so after 100 days, they were driven out of the mountain.
Were you driven out?
Yeah. I was with my family. I was a 5-year-old kid besieged at Deir al-Amr. And yes.
I apologize. I don't know you as much as I know Nadim.
That's fine.
But I've been to both of your homes.
Yeah.
Nadim, you now live in Beit Miri. Hicham, you live closer to Beirut Hazmi.
Yes.
Or close to Hazmi. Is that where you grew up as a child? Was it there?
No, actually, I grew up in Ain al-Rumani, and that was also a defining experience, because Ain al-Rumani was a very hot front during the war. So essentially, the first 5 years of my life during the war were in the Shuf, and then another 7 years in Ain al-Rumani, and and then 1990 came and the war ended. But so if we're talking about the war years, I spent them between the Shuf and the very first early years, and then Ain al-Rumani.
Thank you for letting me ask this, because I don't know these things.
Yeah, that's fine.
And I wanted to go down this road as much as I could. Before we get to the next topic, Nadim, you wanted to say...
Yeah, I wanted to say that...
to save you at some point.
The distinction is...
Throw me over the cliff now.
The distinction is best described in an essay by Albert Hourani, where he describes the ideology of the mountain versus the ideology of the city. So the city, Beirut, is a completely different environment and completely different ideology than the rest of Lebanon, and especially than the mountains, because Beirut became a hub for the whole region from the early 19th century onwards, and it kept on attracting people from the region until the 70s, basically. So, whereas the mountain has its own defined identity, and its sphere of operation is much narrower than Beirut.
Before we continue, may I object about the romanticization of the Ottoman world that I see in Nadim's.
I thought we were going to pass
very quickly, because when you are romanticizing the Ottoman city, you seem to be forgetting that the Ottoman Empire was an Islamic caliphate, and under that Islamic caliphate, like I would say most Muslim-dominated societies, caliphate or not, it was a hierarchical society in which a group of people were on top, just because they had the privilege of being born in a specific sectarian denomination, and others were not on top simply because they were not born into that specific denomination. There's nothing romantic about.
No, but there is something.
I would call this a religious racism.
No, there's something relevant.
There's nothing romantic about that. At all. And also, I mean, talking about the Ottoman city, I mean, the Ottoman city were the place where the Ottoman city were the place where, for instance, Armenian Turks were slaughtered, where Christians in Damascus were slaughtered in 1860, where Christians in Aleppo were slaughtered in 1850. So there's nothing. There's nothing romantic about
you're calling it romantic.
Non-Muslim living in a Muslim caliphate. Okay, so I just want to say there's nothing romantic about that, and I think you're whitewashing what was essentially something that is very problematic and continues to be problematic to this day.
Let me interrupt.
No, but wait. It's not.
You'll get your 1 minute rebuttal. Let me interrupt.
It's not a rebuttal. I agree with him on many things, and I'm even more extreme than he is. But
I don't think this is extremism.
But it's a question. It's a question of interpretation.
Yeah, okay.
Could I let you interpret a little later?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah? Okay, because I think that would. Let me start over. You'll get a chance to talk. I promise. I don't know, because I'll let you talk, but I want to say something. What's happening right now happened in this field, I think in April. I did an episode with Nadim at Alia's. And Hicham, I think you watched parts of that episode and you wanted to comment. This is, I think, April, maybe March?
Maybe.
April, March.
Nadim and I were walking in this field by chance. And I mentioned to Nadim, I said, Nadim,
we were here.
We're walking somewhere in this field. And I said, Nadim, would you be up to doing this? And we agreed back then to wait a bit because you had just been on the podcast.
Right.
So then I invited you to MTV podcast. So the reason we're doing this in Iris Domain, which should be explained, is because this was happening on my phone while walking in Iris Domain. And I couldn't control it. I'm like, Nadim, we have to do this in person.
Because you were calling him at the same time.
I think you were
I remember. Yeah,
it was maybe the day after.
I remember, yeah.
So that's why we're doing it here.
Yeah.
But I'll let you, if you wanted to say something.
No, I just want to say that, the Federalists in Lebanon.
You're going too far.
They've discovered.
Not yet.
Discovered one principle called that the religion of the people have to be the same as the ruler. I mean, it's. I saw it in all the Federalist documents in Lebanon. I don't know if in yours you mentioned it, but if that was the case, we would all be Sunni Muslims, alhamdulillah, and there would be no problem.
Let's leave that to the end.
Somebody needed to pay the jizya, so we couldn't have become financially. It wasn't feasible, but we can go to this more later on.
Yeah, let's say federalism to win. Some more wine.
Some more wine.
I wanted the childhood because I wanted to know how you saw the world changing. You're right, Nadim. In 40 years, everything has changed. And Hicham, we're closer to age. You're 2 or 3 years maybe older than me. I have the same memories of conflict, but my direct experience with it is not the way you saw it up front. And the forced exile, and I think it's good that you're actually using words that people here tend to be shy, they tend to shy away from. This is a form of ethnic cleansing. So I owe you that thanks to making that an emphasis when you speak, not just in alternative digital media. You go on TV, you're very confident and pointing at violence that happened. So I thank you for that. And you bring credibility when you say it too. Even I think it was on MTV 2 weeks ago or last week. The gentleman sitting next to you, I think his name was Albert, right? His name escapes me now.
No.
Alfred?
Alfred, sorry, Alfred, yes. He even said the word canton. And I don't know who thanked him, maybe Marcel thanked him for removing the stigma and emotions around technical words. So I owe you credit for that. You've made federalism, you and others have made it less of a toxic word because it should have never been toxic. So I thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for thanking me.
Even then.
No, please go ahead. Continue, please.
So, understanding of how the Civil War shaped Lebanon.
Yeah.
I think there's some common agreement here. Lebanese were not born to kill each other. Just because there's Christians, Muslims, Druze, Jews living together, that in their DNA they're ready to kill. Obviously, that's not true. That's not the full history of the country anyway. But I will speculate, and maybe I'll start with you, Hicham. 1975, and the build-up to that, meaning the PLO and Fatah's arrival in Lebanon, makes really the story that perhaps you're right, Nadim and I do romanticize to a degree about that Ras Beirut that we both love. Maybe it dies because there's problems that are not, no one can control the outcome of a militia basing itself in Lebanon, and the worst instincts emerge. Is that how you see the Civil War?
I see 1975.
Sorry, I'll just move. Yeah.
Okay. I see 1975 as yet another occasion in which supranational identities destroyed Lebanon, made the possibility of the Lebanese state to defend itself disappear. Because in 1975, the Lebanese state was not defeated militarily. In 1969, certainly, the Lebanese state was not defeated militarily. The Lebanese army would have been capable, strictly speaking, from a military perspective, to handle the Palestinians. The problem was that Islam in Lebanon, Muslims in Lebanon in general, sided with the Palestinian to an extent that you could not send the army, because if you send the army, then the army would split. The Lebanese prime minister boycotted Charles Helou boycotted the Lebanese state without presenting his resignation.
Yeah.
And that led to the paralysis of the Lebanese state, which also implied the paralysis of the Lebanese army. And the moment the state became paralyzed, the moment the army became paralyzed, Christians started automatically. This is where you have the Kata'ib, the Ahrar beginning to arm themselves. And I've read in 1973, actually, after the Melkart Agreement, that Slamin Frangieh calls Pierre Jmail and Camille Chamoun to Babda and tells them, look, there's nothing I can do for you anymore.
Yeah.
They do not consider the army almost to exist anymore. Yeah. If you want to face the Palestinians, you have to face them on your own. So, I mean, essentially, it was 1975, above anything else for me, is yet another occasion in which Lebanese identity, supranational identity, essentially destroyed, paralyzed the Lebanese state, which basically led to a part of the population saying, fine, if the army is not going to do the job, we're going to do the job for the army. And this is where you know, hell breaks loose.
Yeah.
So that's 1975. The problem is, this problem of supranational identity, supranational loyalty is still very much alive today. I mean, when Hassan Nasrallah tells you, I am a soldier in the army of Al-Wali al-Faqih. When Najib Miqati tells you that Saudi Arabia, مرجعية الدينية والسياسية, Saudi Arabia is not just my religious reference. It's also my political reference. So it basically means 50 years later, we're still facing the same dilemma, the same problem, and that problem is the supranational loyalties of a sector of the population. I'm not going to call that sector the Druze because they're not the Druze. They have a very local identity. I'm not going to call that sector the Maronites because there's not the Maronites or the Christians. Because people in Mount Lebanon, Druze or Christians, have a very local identity. The problem remains the same. The problem remains since the foundation of Lebanon, the supranational identities of Sunnis and of Shia. Now, before I end, I want to say something. When I say that, I'm not attacking anyone. I mean, for hundreds of years, you have the world of Islam living, under the Ottomans or before, living in caliphates, living in one caliphate after the other, living in some kind of organic unity. And that was a problem for the Christians because they were Zummiyin. That wasn't a problem for the Sunnis. And so at some point, the Ottoman Empire collapses. The Christians are able, with the help of France, to impose on Muslims an identity or, a country that they never wanted. So I'm not blaming them for having supranational identities. I am saying, however, that these supranational identities at every single turning point is preventing the Lebanese state from acting as a state because it's so to speak, giving the Lebanese state on a plate of silver to its enemies, whether they be the PLO at some point or whether they be the Iranian regime at this point.
So I'll ask you, Nadim, in a bit, but just if I could use that marker and then try to fast forward until today, without getting too detailed, just the narrative, that with or without the PLO and Lebanon, this remains an existential issue, regardless.
Oh, absolutely.
So the civil war outbreak is not really what tore Lebanon apart. It's supranational identities that are not able to coexist.
Fundamentally, yes. The PLO happened to be the trigger in 1975. Nasser, to a certain extent, was a trigger in the 1950s. Currently, it's the Iranian regime. And then I worry, what if this keeps going on and on and on and on? I mean, we are in the mountain. Okay, who would have thought in 1840, I go back to 1840 because it's the first time we had a kind of civil war. Who would have thought in 1840 that 200 years later, we're close to 200 years later after 1840, right? Who would have thought 200 years later there would still be civil wars in Lebanon or ethnic conflict? Well, at this point, I'm wondering, what if we keep saying what we're saying and romanticizing what should not be romanticized? And in effect, that would lead to 100 years from now, our great-grandchildren will be slaughtering one another because we cannot understand what's really going on. So this is why I'm the great, although in my personal life, I love romance, but in politics, I'm the great anti-romanticization. I am for cynicism, actually. I am for that. I am for realism. And I understand that nobody likes a realist because people want to hear something that the realists do not say typically, because the history from a realist perspective is very gloomy. I mean, history is marked by violence and evil but it is what it is. And the realist comes and tell you, well, it is what it is. And okay, maybe we can do something about it, maybe not. But certainly we should not be, again, romanticizing what should not be romanticized.
I will not romanticize.
No, I'm not accusing you.
I will not romanticize the Christian decline of Lebanon. That's not deserving of any romance. So that section will get its due. And I promise that's something that we started at MTV and we can pick up from that here. So there's no romance in a community that doesn't feel politically or in numbers at home right now. That's for sure.
I guess what I'm trying to say, forgive me, I don't plan to interrupt you. I guess what I mean by romanticization is when people get caught so much in what they want to see happening that they seem to forget what is actually happening. It's replacing, so to speak, empirical reality with ideological a priori. This is what I argue.
That's actually a perfect description of me. Because I don't give up on what I want to be happening. Like I don't see I mean, I don't want to get into historical interpretation. It'll take 16 hours.
All right.
But in a nutshell, you see the Christians as the victims, and they are the victims today. And you need
fuck! What the hell was
Shuhaida.
hell was that?
That was not part of the conversation.
No, you can. That was a bleep.
That was a locust.
No, was it?
Yeah.
No, I think it was a.
No, that was
a bat.
No, bat.
A bat. Yes. You know,
that was a bat?
it's attracted to long hair. That's.
Let me.
No, so let me. Yeah. So, and you want to protect one victim, and I see everybody as victims. And I want a future where everybody can live. So, for example, Hezbollah is indisputably...
We're going too far. We're going to go there later. Let me take it back to the understanding of the Civil War. So Hicham doesn't talk about 1975 as the trigger per se. It's supranational identity.
No, I talk about as a trigger for something deeper.
That's what I meant, sorry. The depth of it is not the PLO bringing out the worst in us. It's something deeper. And he just said it. Do you see
George Habash and Wadi Haddad and Shafi al-Hout were students of my father at AUB, and I know them. And when the Civil War started, they sent us people to protect us in Ras Beirut, and so and they're not Muslim. that's one thing.
Do you see the depth beyond 1975?
They're also not Lebanese.
They're not Lebanese. Okay. Well, I mean, how many?
So,
they're not Lebanese. They're from. For me, they are Lebanese because for me, being Lebanese is the attraction of all these people from.
But can I take it back?
Ashrafiyeh was not Lebanese before 1860.
Nadim, just the trigger, the way we talked about it, and the depth for what Hicham describes as a much deeper issue. Do you look at the structural problems of Lebanon in a similar way of supranational identity, or is it strictly a security problem like the PLO?
Yeah. I think nationalism is a bit overrated, and this famous phrase that people like quoting, that two negations do not make a nation, of George Naqash. I don't see the problem with the two negations. I see the problem with the nation. We are not a nation state. We are the remnant of an empire. An empire rules over several nations, and they coexist in the cities of the empire. Sometimes they kill each other. Sometimes there is tension. They all have their external connections, and they are affected by global conflicts, if you like. So we are a bit like that. I wouldn't like to live in a nationalist state where, if the Sunnis of Lebanon, as he describes them, have sympathy with Abdel Nasser, then we have to lock them up in jail and prevent them from publishing or prevent them from...
Is that what I said?
No, but if they how do you prevent... No, you said that the Sunnis had extra territorial loyalties. Yeah. Okay,
it's not an insult.
It's not an insult.
I think that's true.
So basically, we were the only free zone in the whole region. In those days, since we were the only free area in the whole region.
You're right.
So the only place where regional ideas surfaced was here, and the only place where they clashed was here. So nationalism and Islamism and isolationism and all these isms, communism and all, clashed in Lebanon first, and then they spread in the region. Not because they were only Lebanese, because they were regional to start with. So it's either you want a free society where people can clash freely, or you want a place which has which is homogeneous, astaghfirullah, where everybody is the same, and they don't have, and then they kill each other for stupider reasons, like the Maronites did, and the Shias did, and the Sunnis did, and the Druze did, when they were in cantons.
You're missing the point. I'm telling you, when a state faces an existential dilemma, it should be able to defend itself, and that's only its natural right. Unless there's no common identity bounding together the people living in that state within a certain narrative that everybody accepts. And then what you have is a civil war and the breakdown of the state. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying everybody has to have the same idea. I mean, that's where I feel you are, you guys, I mean, you are insisting on putting the Federalist in where we call ourselves as realists. We're just looking at how society is moving and trying to understand what could be done about it. You absolutely have to depict us as, the ultra, right-wing Maronites who want to punish the Sunnis just because they like Nasser. I don't want to punish anyone because they like Nasser.
No, I do.
However, I do
and
not.
They do. They have revised.
I refuse to break diplomatic relations with France and Great Britain, who were traditionally friends of Lebanon, for the sake of Abdel Nasser or for the sake of Egypt. And that was asked of us at the time, and I reject that. I resent that very deeply. That's very different from, denying any Sunni anywhere the right to like Abdel Nasser. These are very, very different things.
Let me interrupt here. So I want to get into how communal anxiety really sharpens during the 1980s and the Syrian era. But there's one section I should have brought up. Just very quickly, may I ask you how you see Fouad Chehab's legacy?
Oh.
And not in a complicated way, more in is it net positive, net negative? How you see him and his role in state building?
I think one of the biggest misunderstandings in Lebanese history pertain to Fouad Chehab. Fouad Chehab, as a commander of the army in 1958, did pretty much nothing to stop the civil war, although he should have intervened to prevent Gamal Abdel Nasser from sending weapons to Beirut, because they did. And he did that because that was the only way for him to become president. So this is how he became president, by allowing the civil war to go on and on. And then Fouad Chehab, who wanted to become president again later in the 1960s, via the Deuxième Bureau, Al-Maktab al-Thani, gave too much leeway to the Palestinians, because he understood at the time that the Christians were not going to vote for him. But he wanted, somebody to vote him back to office, and the way to do that was by getting the vote of the Muslim MPs. So the Maktab al-Thani grew very, very weak on the Palestinians. And by the way, that's not me who said that. I'm almost quoting literally the memoirs of Sami al-Khatib. Sami al-Khatib, we all, I believe, know who Sami al-Khatib was. He was one of the most influential Chehabi officers, and he said our strategy to bring Fouad Chehab back to power was basically once we understood that the Christians were going all the way with the Halif at the time. Halif meaning Pierre Gemayel, Camille Chamoun, and Raymond Ede. He said we understood that the only way for Shehabist restoration, basically, by getting the Muslim vote. And to get the Muslim vote, you had to go lenient on the Palestinians, which is what we did. So I don't find anything good about how Fouad Chehab got to power in the first place, and certainly nothing good about how he tried to come back to power. For me, the hero of Lebanon at the time in the 50s was Camille Chamoun, not Fouad Chehab. But we can go more into that if you want.
So the 6 years of Fouad Chehab's presidency to you does not leave an important footprint. It's more just trying to stay in power and negotiating endlessly with.
No. I'm not telling you I dislike Chehab. I dislike certainly, as I told you, I dislike how he came to power in the first place and how he tried to come back to power. That being said, while he was in power, Fouad Chehab certainly was not a fromagiste. He did not steal from the states. He was an honest man. So that's good. Fouad Chehab understood the importance of having a kind of socioeconomic program to lift up
real national infrastructure projects.
Yeah, and that's also good. Fouad Chehab built lots of state institutions that were needed. So I'm nuanced about Fouad Chehab. I don't think of him as the god of Lebanese nationalism or whatever you want to call it. I don't think I think he was a politician. He wanted power, and his way to power and his planned way to go back to power was very problematic. Fouad Chehab, for instance, did nothing about the slaughtering of Naim Ghabghab. That was the Shuf MP who was killed by the Jumblatis, and he was killed. I mean, he was basically, people stamped on him to death, and nothing happened. Fouad Chehab allowed, and I think that's national treason. You know, there were officers in the army who in 1958 fought along the side of the people who were fighting with Abdel Nasser. And when the war stopped, he allowed them back into the army. So that's an officer in the Lebanese army fighting against the state. And then when the war stops, he's allowed back into the army. I mean, that's insane in my mind. So there's a lot of negative sides to Shehabism. Certainly, I don't like the deuxième bureau role in Lebanese politics. Certainly, he went too far in leaning toward Abdel Nasser. So I mean, there's more negative side than positive side, but there was some positive sides as well.
Nadim, could you comment as much as you can on Fouad Chehab's, whether it's a positive or negative legacy?
No. Okay, I don't want to go into historical revisionism. I'm not a fan of Chehab myself. I see him as part of a global phenomenon. You know,
military rule
from Latin America to Pakistan to Abdel Nasser to Iraq, Syria, Sudan, Numeri, you know, and then yes, and Gaddafi. You know, so that was a fashion in the 60s. That's it. That's all I see. And the Americans favored military strongmen because they thought that democracy needs institutions, and the army is an institution builder. That's all I see.
So that's interesting. A common disliking of Fouad Chehab, maybe not for the same reasons,
I'm not disliking Fouad Chehab. I'm saying that I'm not part of this hagiography of Fouad Chehab, because I agree with all the Deuxième Bureau and his dislike of politics. Is not very democratic.
The reason I wanted to briefly touch on him is because that's the one name I think that is shared among civil society today, and the more right-leaning
out of ignorance.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that.
Let's give a round of applause
let me summarize.
The only man that tried gets a dual flagellation.
Let me summarize.
The one guy who tried. They used to call him Muhammad Chehab. Even that, you know, it's he's dead. I like Fouad Chehab. I'm the only person.
Let me rescue you again.
Thanks, Nadim.
Let me summarize this whole historical revisionism debate. There are two sides. One side says that Lebanese history sucks and it's all conflicts and we all suffered and we should stop it and live separately, Marounistan and all this sort of thing. Enough is enough. I see it in the exact opposite way. I see it that as Hicham said, Lebanon was set up by the Maronites at a time when half the Maronites didn't want it. The Sunnis didn't want it, the Greek Orthodox didn't want it, the Druze didn't want it, and the Shias didn't want it. If you fast forward 100 years later, this has gone. They all want it now. Through different crises, after every crisis, the acceptance of Lebanon grows. So every crisis improves the cohesiveness, and the proof is, look at the Sunnis now. They're revising the period of the PLO and Abdel Nasser and all that, and they're more nationalist, Lebanese nationalist than me, at least.
So we'll touch on identity.
Just to say that it is a very successful experiment that has moved positively over the last 100 years, rather than the description that it was a disaster from the start and it's moved, and everybody's victims, and because we are now in a situation which is unacceptable for everybody.
So let's leave that to the end. I want to get into.
I disagree pretty much with every word you said. That's fine. Okay, go ahead. That's why we're here. Yeah, go ahead, Ronnie.
No, actually, the reason why we're here is because the three of us don't have a security answer to Hezbollah. So what we're doing is offering narrative and maybe some debate-like tradition in the light. If you remember Michel Foucault and Chomsky and Derrida and that kind of stuff, you're the intellectuals of Lebanon today. So I think we're leaving behind a record for people to learn from.
I wish you had said Huntington, Hazem Sari, Fouad Ajami, not Chomsky, and because I dislike the guy. But granted, your intention was good.
No, maybe he means I'm Chomsky and you are Hazem Sari.
That
You know, Edward Said and Fouad Ajami were friends before they debated.
Yes.
Maybe you'll be friends after. All right, let's go back to the 1980s. And Hicham, I think this relates to us in a way. And I'll say it since I pushed you to talk about your childhood, let me talk about mine.
Please.
Memories of Tripoli in the north, memories of the Syrian army, memories of cursing Syrian soldiers, memories.
Yes.
If I say that over and over, will you keep? Bless you. Every sentence, curse the Syrian army. Memories of Arafat's return and then exile.
Yeah.
Memories of
to Tripoli.
Yeah. And the Syrian war against him.
Yeah.
Memories of fundamentalism.
Of course.
Memories
Tawheed.
of Tawheed. Memories of my grandmother getting slapped for not wearing something. That's Tripoli of the 80s. Memories of car bombings hitting Syrian checkpoints, not all of them successful. People dying for no reason in Tripoli. Also, watching LBC at night with my grandmother because she was really interested in what Samer Jaja had to say. Now, I don't think she liked him, but I think she wanted to listen in because that was the other side. That's the Lebanon she didn't see for 15 years. But she could watch it in her living room late at night when there was generator power on, like today, neon lights dangling, like today. Actually, it feels eerily familiar. We're still watching Samer Jaja late at night with neon lights and generator power, except he looks much older. And he makes actually more sense today. But anyway, Samer Jaja is in the background. War is in the background. We cannot go really until maybe Al-Hiri. That's as far as you can go. That's risking it already. So you can't go south from Tripoli.
Madfoun.
Sorry?
Madfoun, that was the
Madfoun was the end, really. Madfoun's further down, though. Hiri Shakka is already problematic. Enfi itself, you couldn't go comfortably around. That's my memory of Tripoli. And my memory of the 90s was all about Syria and not mentioning Syria in public. Don't talk about Assad. Don't look at Hafiz. Don't point at him. Don't interact with Syrian checkpoints. Everything that you really, the Syrian occupation as a child and trying to navigate around it. And we moved to Beirut, where it's very visible. I still think of that stretch of time as defined by Syrian intervention, and everything that could have gone right went wrong. And that includes, and I'm taking it here for a reason, that includes what should have been a true understanding of communal anxiety and the lack of real power sharing so that the civil war or anything like that would happen again. Instead, we had Hafiz al-Assad and his friends. His nominal enemies became his enemies later. But at first, there was no direct challenge to him on the Lebanese side, with the exception of Samer Jaja, who goes to jail. Michel Aoun is sent to France. Other than those two figures, it's defined by acceptance of Hafiz. And key among those players is Rafiq Hariri. But I still think of Syria's rule as the cause, not one of this would have happened anyway.
That's because of what?
The lack of what we're talking about right now, which is how to rectify and never let something like the 1970s happen again. I think we still live in that shadow. I think that's the that's the shadow that lingers 5 decades later, is why Lebanon tore itself apart. For all the reasons we can talk about, whether it's the depth to the conversation you offered earlier, the security that is beyond state control, I think the Syrian years made it impossible to truly reform. And that includes communal harmony and, in essence, Ta'if, which never was implemented. So would you emphasize Syria here in those years? When you're young, you're my age, when you're growing up.
Yeah, I mean, in the 1990s, I was in university and I was a student militant against the Syrian occupation. So, of course, my best friend, Ramzi Irani, was caught and killed during that time. We don't know by whom, but we know, it was done for political reasons. So it could be the Syrian Mukhabarat, it could be people working for the Syrian Mukhabarat, somebody in that camp. So suffice it to say that I have little sympathy for the Assad regime and its goons in Lebanon. But to say that our problems, I want to make sure I got you. Our problems in Lebanon, you're saying, were the result of Syrian occupation? I would say the Syrian occupation was the result of our problems in Lebanon.
Okay, that's what I was trying to get at.
I would, the direction of causality, I would change it.
So Ta'if, lack of implementation has less to do with Syria's role in Lebanon and more to do with the inverse of that, which is what brought Syria into Lebanon. Is that, I'm trying to...
Azizi, what brought Syria into Lebanon? What brought the Palestinians into Lebanon? What brought is the fact that the Lebanese are not one people. The Lebanese are multiple peoples sharing a narrow land, basically. And what is an occupation for one group of people is actually a savior for another group of people, and vice versa. The Maronites or the Christians like to think of themselves as sovereignists, right? I mean, when the French was the occupying power, they were not so sovereignist. When Bashir became president of the republic in the conditions that we all know, they were not. They didn't complain, to the best of my knowledge.
Or when the Syrians fought alongside them.
Or when the Syrians entered and they were fighting, they did not complain either. So nobody is a sovereignist pur jus. It depends on who's the occupier. Again, the occupier for one sector of the population is a savior for another sector and vice versa. That's the fundamental problem. Now, we may dislike one occupier more than the other. We may say Hafez al-Assad did more harm to this country than any other regime or occupier that came to this country, and I agree with that. There are nobody in the world I dislike. There's no regime in the world I dislike more than the Assad père and Assad fils regime. But still, to say that that's the fundamental problem of Lebanon, for me, academically, would be intellectually dishonest.
Not the fundamental problem of Lebanon, more that the fundamental reasons why something like Ta'if simply was dead upon arrival.
The fundamental reason why something like Ta'if was dead upon arrival, because you cannot manage a multi-confessional society within the confines of a centralized regime. So whether it's Syrians or no Syrians, Ta'if itself is bad. Now, the presence of the Syrians made it worse. Fair enough. This is. I mean, I like it when communists who are still communists will tell you Stalin was bad, and that's the problem. Stalin was bad, but Marxism sucks in the first place. The fact that that the theory was wrong. I mean, the fact that you had a monster in power does not mean that the theory was innocent and the monster was just a monster. The theory could be very bad to begin with, and then you have a monster, and then you end up with a nightmare. But that doesn't mean that the theory was right to begin with. Ta'if is a bad idea. Centralized mode of government is a bad idea. No neutrality for a country like Lebanon is a bad idea. Now, when you have all that plus the Syrian occupation, then you have the nightmare that we're living. But that's one thing, and saying that Ta'if could have worked had it not been for Hafez al-Assad, I disagree with that.
Okay, could I ask the same question to you, Nadim?
Am I supposed to disagree with him?
You're allowed to agree.
No, well, I disagree. I'll tell you what I disagree with. I think the problems, the Palestinians suffered from the Syrian regime, the Lebanese, the Jordanians, everybody and most of all the Syrians. I would consider that a regime like the Assad's, the way it's run through mukhabarat and through, a Stalinist type regime, is a problem that destabilized Lebanon and the rest of the region. In that, so I wouldn't put the blame on us because we have different opinions. It's natural to have different opinions. I cannot imagine a country of clones who don't disagree on.
But let me emphasize the question: Ta'if's lack of implementation.
Ta'if, you see, that's why I don't want to go into revision history, because we want to get to the subject. We haven't got to the subject yet. But basically, Ta'if. There are two parts on Ta'if. There is the internal part, which was the same as the constitutional documents of 1976. And the regional part is the Syrian handing Lebanon over to Syria, is basically the rest of the civil war. Yani the Syrian army attacked the villages in the north to give itself an excuse to come in, Beit Millet and Tal Abbas and all that. They used Palestinian organizations who killed more Palestinians than Israel itself. They used, they besieged Zgharta, they besieged Zahle, they besieged Ashrafiyeh, they besieged Beirut, they besieged Tripoli, they besieged everywhere, bombed it to submission, got rid of the people who would not compromise, and that's how they conquered the place. And that's how they conquered Syria.
Do you think
they reconquered Syria during the last 10 years? They bombed city by city. They depopulated cities. They killed. They assassinated people. They recruited thugs inside. That's exactly what they did here.
Hisham's description of Ta'if, more or less dead upon arrival.
No, I disagree.
You disagree. So why not? Do you think of it as the Syrian occupation preventing it?
I think the text of Ta'if is the most brilliant text you can think of to resolve.
Its lack of implementation. Do you put that on the Syrian occupation, or do you put that on what Hicham is saying, really? Which is, at the end of the day,
no, it's not. Yeah, I do put it on it's on the Syrian regime cloning itself in Lebanon through Lebanese, they did in Syria.
Perfect. So let me then fast forward a bit, and this is really laying the foundation to something that we can discuss later, which is the lack of Levantine cosmopolitanism in the region and its decline, and the birth pangs of your determined drive, which is a federal Lebanon. That's what I want to get.
Suicide, you mean?
Everyone's behaving. Not now. Not now. There's one thing, and Hicham and I have spoken about it. We actually dedicated an episode to it on MTV. And,
I heard. Yeah.
And maybe half of the episode was the ethos of power sharing and its reform. Hicham has already stated it, that it didn't work for the reasons he stated. You're blaming it primarily on the Syrian occupation. Something that has nothing to do with the Syrian occupation in itself directly is the Senate. I don't think, and you tell me if you see it differently, I don't think Hafiz al-Assad gave about the Senate.
The Senate in Lebanon?
The Senate that it was never installed.
Yeah, I don't think we do either.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is why I wanted to ask both of you this.
Ilyas Mahanna wrote a piece on the Senate and dismissed it completely.
So, but let me mention it briefly. We don't need to get deep into the Senate. We know what it's supposed to do, and it didn't happen. We know it's a sectarian hall of power alongside what's supposed to be a merit-based parliament. It never happened.
It doesn't work.
Why do you think it didn't happen? Would you blame the Syrians?
Listen, let's not go into details.
I need to go into details on this, because I think the lack...
We are talking about a treaty. A treaty works initially because people sit down to make a treaty. They have goodwill. So whatever they write is irrelevant. They're going to come out with an agreement. When the treaty ceases working, what's inside the treaty is also irrelevant, because we will argue about the interpretation of every clause forever.
But the ethos of decentralization and the Senate never happened. Yeah. I can't think of a direct link between Syrian occupying forces and the lack of that?
I can think of many direct links, and and you can point to individuals who were planted in parliament, in institutions, in the army. We developed an army of 60 to 70,000 people in Lebanon. We became like Syria. It was cloning Syrian institutions and other. We don't need more than 10,000.
So it's down to individuals.
So we were being cloned into to becoming like the neo-Baathists.
So then it's not a question about Lebanese not wanting it. It's a question about individuals that didn't do it. I'm not seeing Syria's role here in preventing it from happening, but you're saying that it's bad actors working alongside the Syrian.
I don't think people meant it when they, I think the biggest lie in Lebanon started in 1926. Here, I agree with him, which is that we're going to become secular. That this is temporary and temporary measures until we become secular. We never wanted to. We are happy being looking back on the Ottoman period, which if you look at the writings of Michel Chiha and of all his group of people, they romanticized the late Ottoman period, the Mutasarrifiyya, and the Maronite Church had lobbied for it as a unit with a council where everybody is represented. The Europeans at the time, because of their frame of mind, they wanted to set 3 cantons. They wanted to have 2 cantons first, one Druze, one Maronite, and then they thought, well, the Greek Orthodox. They wanted three cantons.
The reason I wanted to get into the Senate, we've gone too far back now, is because if I could make this case, and you can tell me if you don't agree.
I don't agree. I'm just Go ahead.
Everything here is the justification or the reason something like federalism, I think, speaks to a lot of Lebanese, whether or not you're here, there is a growing appetite for some form of communal autonomy. Whether or not you talk about it, it's happening. Whether or not you talk about it, it's happening. So
the difference between us is minimal. He thinks it's the solution. I think it's wrong.
That's why
let's simplify things.
I'm trying.
And the reason is Hezbollah. Let's cut to the chase because you only have half an hour left.
We have a Q&A after.
Oh, you do?
With permission from Sarmad, if he's still here. Yeah. The reasons you today advocate for something like federalism, is it fair to suggest that it's because even something like the Senate never happened? In other words, we both lived in the US. We know what federalism looks like there. And one of those aspects of it, not the only one of it is the Senate there. It seems to work fine for America. It should, in principle, work here. It didn't. And whether Nadim's suggestion matches yours or not, it's separate, I think. Does that push you to champion federalism more? Not federalism in itself, more communal autonomy, rather than talking about the Senate today?
I don't think the Senate would have provided a radical solution for the problems we are talking about here. I think you're going on a very technical detail. It's an important technical detail, but it's a technical detail nonetheless. I think we're going a bit off track by talking too much about the Senate. I mean, we can talk about the Senate but no, I mean, the short answer, no. That's not why I believe.
Then I'll stop you there.
Okay.
Let's go to March 14. I think March 14 is a great idea. I think it's when communities see eye to eye. They wake up from the Civil War. It's political parties that are legitimate, not alternative or civil society. They're good, honest Lebanese on the streets. They're calling on the Syrians to leave. I think of that as a moment to champion.
I think of what you just said as a complete, in my mind, respectfully, misrepresentation.
You were about to curse.
No, what happened? First of all, in March 14th, there were, I was there, by the way. There were very, very few Shia there. The bulk of the people who were there were Sunnis, Christians, and Druze. So it's not true that all communities were there. One big community was not there. And eventually the political force that broke the back of March 14 came from that community. In fact, not only it came from that community, but in the last elections, may I remind you, that out of 562,000 Shia voters who actually voted, 95% of these people, 95%, I have the numbers, Nadim, 95% voted for Hezbollah. And so that's one thing. Yeah. Of course, the same community then provided the same force that broke the back of another beautiful moment, the revolution.
October 17.
October 17. Yeah. I was there too. So first of all, it's not exact to say the Lebanese communities came together. One big community was not there. That's one. Two, the fact that Samer Jaja was in prison and the Lebanese forces were on the streets calling for the Syrians to leave, because they knew that as long as the Syrians were there, their Jaja will still remain in prison. That does not mean that these people were not acting as Christians with a very defined communal identity, just because they happen to basically sit side by side by the Jumblati PPSP. So what happened was not, this is where I find myself in a crusade against romanticism. 14th of March, first of all, out of the four big community, one was not there. Second, the people who were there did not cease operating as Christians when they were Lebanese forces, no, you cannot, or Aounist. They did not cease to operate as Druze when they were there as supporters of Ali Jumblat. They did not cease operating as Sunnis when they were there, driven by their anger at the loss of Rafiq Hariri. So that doesn't mean that that was a day where communitarianism disappeared and then, the bad people came later on and they pushed us back to the confessional divide line. What happened in 2005 was that the different communities, three of the four big communities, had a common enemy, which was the Syrians. And they basically, so there was a nexus between these communities. That doesn't mean that day, you see what I mean?
Before you talk, I'll just say it
disappeared.
Okay, so since I wasn't allowed to interject something,
okay,
I'll do it now.
Please. Yeah, go.
I think you're wrong.
Okay.
Yeah. And the March 14 you experienced is not the March 14 I saw. Maybe we were on the same plaza at the same time, but I think you're looking for something.
No, I think... no, okay. Fair enough.
You didn't let me.
Fair enough.
MTV, you did this all the time. I was very nice to you too.
Fair enough.
Every Shia I know from March 14 is still with me. And every Hezbollah member that did not show up on March 14, who are now speaking the language of October 17, I think they matter, and they're Shia. Whether or not it's 5% or 95% of the community, there were Shia on the streets of Beirut. The same patriotic party, 8 months after March 14, joins Hezbollah. That's not because they're bad Christians. It's not because they're letting go of their community. That's bad politics. Any team that decides to work alongside Hezbollah from 2006 onwards, all of them are damaged goods. And they're damaged, I think you're right. You said the political force that ended March 14. I would say it's more a security force. I don't think Hezbollah won through politics. It won through violence. But I don't subscribe to this way of looking at Lebanon. The Shia were not there. No, they were there.
Some Shia were there.
A lot of Shia were there.
Azizi, what happened a week before March 14?
March 8.
And how many Shia were there in comparison to how many Shia?
500,000.
Half a million. Yeah. So that's the large majority of the community.
I completely
agree. You can very well look at a few Christian leftists who supported.
Can I rescue you?
Let me finish those. Yeah, then you can.
No, I want to rescue him.
You can very well look at a few Christian leftists who in the 1960s and the 1970s supported the Palestinian cause, and they were ready to go all the way in support of the Palestinian cause. That does not deny the fact that the bulk of the Christian community at the time did not support the Palestinian cause.
Right.
Okay. Same thing, you can look at somebody I respect a lot, like let's say Luqman Salim, may he rest in peace, who was there in March 14 and others, and they were there and I respect them, but that does not deny the fact that the large bulk of the Shia community was not there. In fact, it was in the quite opposite direction. That's a fact. See, this is where I begin my crusade against changing facts for the sake of political romance.
This is not romance versus facts. You're discrediting the Shia that showed up because they're not enough.
I'm not discrediting anyone. I'm telling you the bulk of the community was not there because that community has different political choices stemming from its own identity. I'm not discrediting anyone. I'm just describing.
Yes. You're right. But so what? So what? 90
I feel the lady should join us.
No, she's staying there. Trust me, you don't want to. We can't see you. Are there people still there?
I think you should.
Oh, good. Everyone's still there.
But
worst case scenario, they all leave and we're like, there's no one at the end.
What if? And we run out of wine.
No, there's enough wine.
There's enough wine.
Essentializing communities, to me, is not the right way of looking at our problems. And I don't think the thousands of Shia that showed up on March 14, or the tens of thousands or more that were there on October 18, 2019, I think of them as Lebanese and deserving of everything we're talking about.
Did I say they were not?
You're saying things that I think essentialize the Christians of Lebanon.
If I tell you that 95% of the Shia voters in 2022 voted for Hezbollah and Nabal, and I show you with numbers, am I essentializing or am I just citing numbers? So according to you, numbers do not matter when we're talking political analysis?
One more thing, then you can talk. One more thing. No, you're right. You're right. Something like 75% of the Christians of Lebanon voted for the worst president in Lebanese history.
Bleep.
Am I gonna blame them for? No. I have to get this part down. You want out. You're looking for ways to get out. That's what you're doing.
You're not listening to me.
I'm listening. I've listened to you. I'm listening very carefully.
No. You're not listening to me. I'm telling you. First of all, I'm not blaming anyone. I'm not essentializing anyone. I'm telling you.
You discredited March 14 because not enough Shia were there that day.
I'm telling you, your analysis of Shia politics is wrong. I'm telling you that when you have a large chunk of a population choosing over and over and over again one political side, you can't just say, well, I have a couple of friends who chose the other side.
Can I settle this?
And then, they do not matter. Numbers matter.
Ronnie, let me help.
Balances of power matter. Correlations of force. That's basic political analysis. You cannot just forget about that because you don't like that. Most of the Shia identify currently with Hezbollah and Harakat Amal. We cannot deny that just because a few of our liberal Shia friends joins us in the streets of March 14. And so that's a fact. Now the question is, okay, what do we do about that? Can we just continue with a country in which you have different communities with different and radical different political choices, and that I'm afraid that could lead us another 20 years or 30 years into yet another civil war? Do we say, okay, you know what, if this is what's going to happen, perhaps we should consider, first we should ask ourselves, should we continue as a unified country, even if that means another round of civil war every 20 or 30 years? Or if we can't continue as a civil country, should we at least consider changing the political regime so this doesn't happen? I think these are legitimate questions to ask. What is not legitimate is basically saying, just because you had in 1943 a bunch of Christians who were Arab nationalists, forgetting about the fact that most Christians were not. Just because a bunch of Christians were in the 60s pro-Arafat or pro-Palestinian cause, forgetting about the fact that most Christians were not. That's wrong political analysis.
Everything you said is actually true. I'm not disagreeing with the facts. I'm disagreeing about what to do with them. Nadim.
I still think we're beating around the subject, but let me solve the numbers issue. 97.6%. 97.6. You can hear 97.6% of Syrians voted for Bashar al-Assad 6 months before the revolution. Does this mean that 97.6% of Syrians were pro-Assad and then suddenly they woke up and they're not? No, it means that there is a political party that has hegemony, that has hijacked a whole community, and that community is the first victim. Yani the Shia of Lebanon are the first victims of Hezbollah. It's their children who are being indoctrinated when they are kids. It's their young men who are being sent to die in Iraq and in Syria and in Yemen. It's they are the ones who are the first victims of Hezbollah. You're portraying us as the victims, the Christians. Look, I'm wearing a noon cufflink. Whereas I see that we are all victims of a fascist organization, criminal fascist organization, that is part of a regional phenomenon that is part of a broad Shiite revival that started in the 50s, and if you want to, and that has its worst manifestation here, and we're all victims. We have to find a way of getting rid of that mode of life that we are in, because separation will not resolve it. And the example I give is Gaza. And people, if Hamas is in Gaza and the PLO is in the West Bank with all the international support and all that, does it solve things? No, because there's contagion, and now you have the whole place is unsettled. I don't think anyone can live. That's why I'm more extremist than you are. And you're saying the Shias love Hezbollah, Mabruk alayhon, let's separate and we live alone. Anna, I think we can't. Not even. No, there's no way we can't. We can't. And they are the first victims. And the biggest victims in this whole thing are the Sunnis, and regionally. And it's Sunnis who don't have leadership in Lebanon, Sunni cities that were destroyed in Syria. Most of the displaced people and the ethnically cleansed areas in Syria and Iraq are Sunni. And we're all victims of a certain mode of politics represented by the trinity of Bashar al-Assad, Hassan Nasrallah, Iran, and Russia. And Ukraine is suffering the same thing. So I see it as a bigger problem that we all suffer from, rather than as me and or a small section, that we can separate. And even if we do see it like that, you cannot isolate yourself from such a bad actor, because they will find a way of involving you. And if they start a war with Israel, how can you avoid it?
I'll leave that to the end, because that's exactly where I wanted to wind down the episode, with how we see things moving forward.
Let me give credit to Hicham.
Yeah.
Hicham, I think, is very brave and very honest, and he puts forward many straw men that I love to shoot down. So I'm grateful to him for
let me actually, a couple of things you said I think are problematic from a comparative perspective. When you say most of the Syrian people voted for Assad.
97.6%.
Okay, I know that. The difference is the elections in Lebanon, while imperfect, cannot be compared to elections in Syria. We know that elections in Syria are ridiculous. We know that they do not represent the population. But it's simply not true. So this is where your comparison does not stand at all. It's simply not true that elections in Lebanon are as dishonest and as unrepresentative as elections in Syria. So while we can disagree that Assad does not represent 96% of the population simply because he got 96% of the vote, we cannot disagree that the Shia duo actually represents a majority of the Shia because they got 95%. Your comparison is very problematic. It's simply not true that Samer Jaja is not extremely popular in Sharri. that's not true.
In Bsharri.
It's simply not true that Walid Jumblat is not extremely popular in the mountains. And
Jaja is more popular in Akkar than anybody else.
The point is, your comparison, you're drawing a comparison between a non-perfect election, such as the one going on in Lebanon, and a completely a joke of an election, such as the one going on in Syria. And from an intellectual perspective, from a comparative perspective, that's problematic. So this is one thing. The other thing that you're basically suggesting, we are all victims here. Well, I mean, it's different because in the sense that even if the situation is bad for everyone, we are vulnerable toward that situation in a very, very different way.
We are doing the best. We are the best. We have leadership. We have disagreements. We are preserving our own culture. We are far better off as Christians, if you want, than the Shias who are hijacked by Hezbollah.
They're not hijacked. They're voting for these people. They are not. So the description.
The voting system doesn't allow them to vote anywhere else.
They were people from the opposition who basically participated in they got less than 5%.
Let me give you one example.
The idea of hijacking for me is problematic. This is where facts do not matter.
Okay. Let me give you one example. Yeah. You and me, if we stand for elections here, you formalist, I formalist, the audience hopefully will be split sort of either towards you or towards me. One of us will win, and there will be a small minority in the middle who will swing the vote. But if you and I are forced, like Amal and Hezbollah are forced to form one single list, nobody has then we have total hegemony. Nobody can stand against us. And you put a donkey on our list, he will win, because we represent the two sides that are forced to stand together. One has been forced to stand with the other through a massacre that lasted 3 years in not far from here in Qlim al-Tufah and through the first assassinations were of the Shia leadership of Amal, and the communist Shia leadership and the nationalist Shia leadership, and that's fact too. You have a criminal organization that has achieved hegemony over a community through that kind of behavior, through assassinations, through wars, through etc., and then used that monopoly to recruit feeble-minded Christians on one side to join them, who joined them for political purposes.
So the Christians who joined them were feeble-minded, but the
Aunists who joined Hezbollah
them were just victims?
Yes, they were also victims.
Okay, wow. Quite interesting.
Let me steer it back.
Do you see what you just did? Because you're Christian and you feel very much your Christian identity. When you're talking about the Christians, they are feeble-minded because a few of them joined Hezbollah. But we're talking about the tens of thousands of Shia who are voting for Hezbollah. They're not feeble-minded, they're just victims. Does that make sense to you?
No, I'm being partisan. I'm anti-Aunist.
You're being politically correct.
I'm being partisan.
Let me steer it back to let me steer it back, if that's possible, please, to two things. First, and I'll try to segue from the numbers thing to the intellectual curiosity for federalism, because I think that's an appealing chapter. The intellectual merits behind it. I guess there's a difference in not in numbers. Numbers are real. That's true. I think it's sometimes even more than 95% end up voting for those parties. I think it's more that, and maybe I'm wrong. I guess I could be wrong here. I still sympathize with those voters, and I still think of them as legitimately Lebanese too. I think that's where
the 5%,
the 95%.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I still think of them as part of this country, even when they're voting for one of the most corrupt parties in the country and a violent killing machine. I can't think of Lebanon without them. And the reasons for why they're voting for those parties, I think, at the end of the day, it's closer to what Nadim was saying, not fully though. It's more in, I don't blame them. And I think Hezbollah in particular has destroyed this country in every way possible, including leaving no other options. The Memphid lists are meaningless. The Muwatinun, that long list, long name for a list, a long list too, I don't think is going to ever really resonate anyway. But that wasn't the viable alternative, regardless.
But it was a very healthy one.
Let's fast forward to the appeal to federalism. I have sympathies towards federalism. I don't know where the misunderstanding came from. I lived my most productive years in a federal country, the US. I mean, my heart wasn't there always, but I think that system works. And it clearly works for the US. It could work for Lebanon too. So it's an open-minded intellectual exercise here. Where does your curiosity from federalism come from? Is it going back to those early years?
No, I mean, that's a good question. I'll tell you academically, as a political scientist, it's simply wrong to govern a multi-confessional society within a centralized system of governance. Think about the history book. I mean, every country is supposed to have a history book.
No.
But the fact is, when you have different communities, you also have different interpretations of history. So, I mean, if you have one single history book that you have to impose on everyone, how can you do that? For instance, Hassan Nasrallah, will you write about him that he's like the hero who liberated the South, or will you write about him that he's an Iranian agent? He's both things to different people. So it's quite wrong to, I would say academically, to imagine that you can run a country that is multi-sectarian, where you have multiple sectarian identities operating within it, from within the confines of a centralized system of government. And also, I mean, again, to go back to your question, where my interest in federalism comes from. I mean, when I ask myself, okay, I'm a comparativist, so this is how I think via comparison. So I ask myself, okay, we're not the only society throughout the world, throughout history, that went through rounds of civil wars and ethnic conflict. What did other societies that also suffered from ethnic conflict and identity-related frictions, and somehow found a way to basically become more stable? What did they do? What was that way?
Yeah.
And over and over and over again, that's some kind of federalism.
Yeah.
I say some kind of federalism because there are multiple. Federalism is actually federalisms, right?
Yeah.
But always some kind of federalism. So how did, the Catholic and the Protestants and the Germanophones and the Francophones in Switzerland, how did they overcome centuries of internal war? Federalism. Yeah. How did the Wallon and the Flamand overcome deep sectarian hatreds?
They haven't.
They haven't. True. Actually, that's true. But then, so how do they live with that without falling?
And they're not living. They have more paralysis than we do. Right?
Well, how do they go through that without falling into political violence? What kind of regime allow groups that fundamentally are very different and do not like one another, yet to coexist peacefully without falling into what political science calls the civil war trap, on and on and on. So every time it's federalism. So hence my interest in federalism from a comparative perspective. I don't believe that it's a good idea to run a country that is, when you have multiple peoples within it, to run it from a centralized perspective. It has to be some kind of federalism plus neutrality, because the different peoples of that country cannot agree on who's a friend and who's an enemy when it comes to external powers. Again, go back to Switzerland. Had they, say, intervened on the side of France during the First World War, well, the German part of Switzerland would have found an issue with that. Had they intervened on the side of Germany, the French part, would have found issue with that, and then that would have led to civil war. I think we are on a very similar situation here. If we intervene when we intervene on the side of the Palestinians, the Christian side of the population has an issue with that. Now that we are close to Iran, the Sunni and the Christian and the Druze part of the population have an issue with that. So when I think about all these issues from a comparative perspective, I keep thinking that the only formula, if there is a way, and I'm saying if there is a way, I'm not certain there is a way for Lebanon to be stable. Maybe there's no way for Lebanon to be stable, and maybe with it we should think some kind of separation. I don't find that a horrible idea to think about. I believe people in Greek Cyprus live far better than we do here. So separation or the end of a country, in my mind, it's not a tragedy, because individuals matter. Ideologies of nationalism do not matter. Countries do not matter. What matters is the individual. If for the future of Lebanese people, Lebanese individual living here, it's better to go separate ways. It doesn't. I don't find that a bad idea. That being said, before going that far, from a comparative perspective, as a comparativist, as a political scientist, I can tell you that typically societies that suffered from decades of civil war, in some cases centuries of civil war, and then eventually grew out of that and became stable, that happened via some kind of neutrality and some kind of federalism.
So before we go to you, Nadim, just is it through the PhD process that this idea was convincing, or does it go back to the earlier notions of
no, I see. Well, obviously when I went to the States I was 30, so I was already reading about politics before going to the States. So no, that's actually earlier than that. But then let me tell you that nothing I read during the 6 years in graduate school convinced me that I was wrong about that specific point. If anything, everything I read, all the people I've spoken to, and obviously I've spoken to a lot of people working on contentious politics, civil wars, ethnic conflict, what have you, actually suggested that, yes, you have to accept that identities are socially constructed, but once they are constructed, you cannot unconstruct them at will. Identities are less flexible than many of us think they are. The Druze identity, the Maronite identity, the Sunni identity, the Shia, these are not misunderstandings. These are not things that we will wake up one beautiful morning and discover that they will disappear. They will not disappear, and they are legitimate, and they are here to stay. And so the question is, how do you manage that diversity? What do you do for people with different identities, different political choices, different feelings about things, and yet sharing the same land, and in our case, a very narrow land, and yet to live together. And academically, I can tell you that's some kind of federalism. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why this idea, which in my mind is on the one hand empirically proven, and more importantly, it's liberal, because federalism is basically vivre et laisser vivre. Federalism basically means if a majority in Saida does not want people to allow women to, go to, swim and if this is what the majority wants, who am I, Hicham Bou Nassif, to say you have no right? And if a majority wants something different, then that's fine. Point is, every culture respects the other culture, provided its own choices are also respected. And that I don't see that happening within a centralized system of government. I see that happening easier within some kind of decentralization, and federalism is the ultimate decentralization.
So I'll leave the last question, which we're approaching, to the issue that you hinted at, which I share, is that there could be a fait accompli, which is eventual separation anyway. Whether federalism works or not, that could be where things are moving gradually. I'm curious about, and I watched on MTV and I liked that split screen. I think it was a highway. I don't remember where exactly, where the somebody next to you pointed and said, "That's current Lebanon, and that's federal Lebanon. There's no difference." In other words, these cars are moving, people are moving back and forth. I appreciate that. It's kind of demystifying and also saying that, look, not much changes on the ground in terms of your ability to get places. It's more about autonomy and expression. And I guess born from what you saw as growing up and fast forwarding until today, the comfort of a community that you see which is on the decline and needs to be saved. I think that's the spirit of it.
But I mean, of course, yes, you're right. But even if it weren't on the decline,
it's a solution anyway.
It's a solution anyway. Right. Even if we were talking in the 1950s, when demographically nobody was on the decline, right? You do not run a country that way, like Lebanon, within a centralized system of government. And you do not run a country like Lebanon without neutrality, because we do not agree on the basic choices of foreign policy. This is, by the way, why I disagree strongly with Taif, because Taif not only does not contain neutrality, in fact, the philosophy of Taif makes neutrality impossible. Because Taif says very clearly that we are an Arab country and we have to abide by whatever the Arabs decide to do, what have you, which basically means if the Arabs want to fight Iran, we'll have to fight Iran with the Arabs. So if the Arabs want to fight Israel, we are with the Arabs. Also, Taif, by the way, says we also should have علاقات مميزة مع الشقيقة سوريا. So that means not only you cannot be neutral, if there are quarrels between Arabs and non-Arabs, if there is a quarrel between the Syrian state and another state, from within the confines of Taif, we cannot be neutral, because according to the alaqat mumayyaza, we have to be with our dear brotherly Syria.
Let me push just quickly on 2 points. Yeah. If federalism is the viable solution, which you described in terms of other countries' experiences, could you suggest why it's not something that took at least the mainstream attention before? If you go, sorry.
It's been around for a long time, but I think...
so sorry to interrupt. Is it more an expression because of the anxiety, that it's heightened now because of that, rather than going back to the 50s and 60s, for example?
No, I mean, listen, I was a federalist in the 1990s when the Syrians were there, but I mean, in the 1990s, you couldn't go on TV and say, I am for federalism. So, so federalism has always been there. But, if you're proposing an alternative for a system, and the system seems to be working, you will not get a lot of people. You'll not get a lot of attention. When there's clearly a crisis in the system, and the system has collapsed, and you're suggesting an alternative, then actually more people want to hear about what you have to say, because people understand that the system is not working. So the time for federalism has come in terms of grabbing the attention of people. But federalism itself has been there for a long time.
If I could describe your role the way I see it, it's being the narrator behind that cause on television, oral expression, sometimes in between shows on MTV. That's how I got to know you. So I think you are filling that role effectively. Another quick point: if federalism were to happen, does that require a security pact with Hezbollah?
Well, see, that's another good question. So let me tell you, I think I just said that federalism is federalisms. Now, we can think of one kind of, just as we say la markaziyya and la markaziyya muwassa'a. We can have federalism, federaliyya and federaliyya muwassa'a. Federaliyya muwassa'a so much that it becomes close to some kind of confederation. And if we end up with something close to a confederation,
for example,
then we can say, okay, if the Shia majority regions vote democratically to keep Hezbollah, that is fine. It's their sovereign choice. However, if people in Perry vote democratically not to allow Hezbollah, that's also fine then. So essentially, you end up with some kind of pact where you have, if there's one component of the population, one region of the population has decided freely to allow Hezbollah to retain its arms, that's their choice. If Tripoli, by contrast, decided not to allow Hezbollah to, that's also their choice, and we have to abide by the rules of the game. So from that perspective, yes, federalism/confederalism can provide some kind of, solution for the problem. Whereas I don't see that happening within the confines of a centralized state.
As far as you know, maybe it's premature to ask this. Can you think of how Hezbollah would react to this kind of process?
Oh, I mean, that does not require a lot of imagination. Hezbollah, who controls Hezbollah now is thinking, what mine is mine and what yours is mine as well. So almost by definition, Hezbollah is going to reject any kind of
system change or
any. I mean, Hezbollah currently is a great force for the status quo. federalism is an anti-statico idea. So almost by definition, you have a clash between, the federalist logic and the Hezbollah logic. The Khomeinis now, or the Hezbollahis now, are the great, the French used to call them les Jacobins. The Jacobins of the French Revolution were the great centralizers, whereas the Girondins wanted some kind of decentralization in France. Hezbollah now is
that kind of
the Jacobins, the great centralizers, because they control the centralized system.
So how do you manage? I mean, I know it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
So that's why it's hypothetical.
Yeah.
How do you manage a security problem like that with something like federalism or confederalism?
Yeah.
Does it require? And I'm not suggesting this is the way forward. I'm just thinking through it.
Yeah.
Does that require a competitive security arrangement, which could look more like the 1980s? It wasn't federalism, obviously, but you had multiple security forces competing.
See, I don't like comparisons with the 1980s because that was a civil war.
Yeah.
And all I'm thinking is, what can we do to avoid going back to the civil war? But I am thinking about some kind of, you lived in the States. Every state has its own National Guard, right? You have the National Guards in California. You have the National Guard in different states. So you can, for instance, imagine Hezbollah becoming some kind of National Guard for the South, if the majority of the people of the South want that. Whereas you can imagine people in Tripoli voting not to have a National Guard, or voting to have a National Guard that would be recruiting its members from the people of Tripoli.
So it's more Hezbollah, the political party, not Hezbollah, the militia. That's, in other words, so long as there's this machine, any idea is going to be cut short. But I think the way you're describing the Hezbollah National Guard, it sounds like a disarmed Hezbollah.
No, not a disarmed Hezbollah, but Hezbollah that is confined from a military perspective and a security perspective to the part of the country that wants Hezbollah. Whereas now we can have Hezbollah. I mean, maybe here there's a Hezbollah. I mean, who knows, right?
Yeah.
So this is what I don't want to see happening. If the majority of the Shia democratically want to have Hezbollah military presence in the south, I abide by that.
I see. So it's an acceptance of that?
Yes.
Okay.
Provided they also accept that if the majority of people in Tripoli, if the majority of people in Ashrafi, if they do not want that, then, you cannot have Hezbollah security presence and military presence there.
It is the most interesting academic exercise happening right now in Lebanon. The appeal to system change and the ideas that are emerging.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you taking me further into the future. Before we wrap it up, though, Nadim, this debate is born from 2 episodes, really. And I think it stems from your divergence from that option moving forward.
It was only 30 seconds,
maybe something less than a minute for sure.
Yeah.
It was less than a minute. Could you elaborate on what Hicham just said, and if there's anything you see different?
Yeah, I see it completely different because, Hicham is lucky that everything he's read has proved him right. And the more I read, the more I think I'm wrong. I call myself a repentant economist, and I'm trying to unlearn everything I've done. So we're in a different phase of, I'm re-examining.
Did I say everything I read proved me right?
Yeah, you said that your thesis, through 8 years of studying, has been reinforced, and it's been
Azizi, I said everything I read about the possibility of federalism finding a solution for a country like us proved me right about this specific point. But I didn't say that everything I read about anything proved me right about anything. That would be completely different.
But you see, I don't see the mechanism. And no, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. If anything, I've participated in lots of international negotiations. And if you're going to negotiate a treaty, you have to choose the time. And your negotiation is with a party that does not want to negotiate and that has the whole cake. So I think there is a conversation to be had whether such a negotiation has any chance of success from a practical and realist level, because Hezbollah now basically doesn't have to do anything. All they have to do is block, and the country is disintegrating, and they're taking over gradually. And in 1 week, in 3 weeks, we won't have a central bank. In a couple of months, we won't have an army chief.
True.
And then we won't have a judiciary. We don't have a constitutional council. The country disintegrate while they're watching without anything. So there's no incentive for them to. So from a purely practical negotiation, I don't see it working.
But who said
from an ideological perspective, I am far more extreme than you are, because I reject them completely, not on behalf of Christians or Muslims or Sunnis or Druze, even on behalf of Shia. And I think the Shias are the ones who will reject them eventually the most, and they are the ones who are suffering most from them. And the future of all of us depends on better actors coming together. Yani we don't have to choose between. I don't want to name names. We don't have to choose between bad actors and take. But there is a better way of existing. Even in Europe, there is. In Europe now, you have bad actors like Putin, like some like Orban or whatever. I'm less compromising with bad actors and I'm less acceptant. You're the nice guy. I'm not. If you want.
Nadim, first of all, I don't see as anything I said as extreme.
But you are described as extreme. I'm more extreme than you are.
I like to think of myself as a realist who's looking at facts. I understand history is in politics. I mean, human nature is imperfect. Society is imperfect. So there's no such a thing as a perfect solution. I'm trying to come up with an imperfect solution for an absolutely tragic situation. And by the way, something I note about this imperfect solution of mine, how easy it is to criticize it, and most of the time people have no plan B. Okay, so let us say let's say that's not the solution. So what is actually the solution? Most of the people who are spending days on end criticizing federalism do not have a better idea. And I think that speaks a lot to the benefits of federalism. But that's not the point. My point is, when you're saying eventually they will reject Hezbollah, I don't see the Alawi Syrians rejecting.
I see them very much doing
the Assad regime. They had a chance in 2011, and in fact, the majority of them. But I think you know that I study civil-military relations.
Yeah.
I spent years on end studying the Syrian military. I went to Turkey and for 4 months, and I interviewed hundreds of Sunni officers who defected. They were all Sunnis. I didn't see one single Alawi officer who defected from the Assad regime. And I know that Alawi officers, simply put, did not defect, and the majority of them, the extreme majority, overwhelming majority of the community remained loyal to the Assad regime. I don't see the Shia in Iraq defecting from the Hashd.
They are. You have the Tishrin movement in Iraq.
Aziz, let me.
I'm not very serious.
I'm not saying any community. There's no community in the world. I agree with that. That is, 100% a unified actor. But there are clear majorities among the Alawis of Syria, for instance, that remain loyal to this day to the Assad regime, despite the horrors that regime perpetrated in Syria. This is why I have a problem with what you're saying from methodological perspective, because I take facts, brutal as they are, ugly as they are, and I try to build my political analysis on these facts. Whereas what you're doing, you are so morally repulsed, and it's morally repulsive. I agree with that. But you are so morally repulsed by the fact that a majority of Alawis are loyal to Assad, or a majority of Shia are loyal to Hezbollah, that you seem to deny that fact and just project a beautiful future in which the Shia will eventually gloriously rebel against Hezbollah. I don't see that happening. I don't see that happening in Syria, and this is where we are.
What to do about it? You're right. Yeah. But you see, because I don't see it as essentialist that people who are Alawis are born pro-Assad.
Yeah.
I see that a regime like Assad and a party like Hezbollah has methods of establishing hegemony through assassination, through dependency, through blackmail, through persecution, through war, provoking war. I mean, the 2006 war was deliberately provoked by Hezbollah to reestablish its hegemony over its own community and and its credentials as a. So these are methods that Assad uses, that the Hashd use, that Hezbollah uses, that bad actors use, that Putin uses, and so I can see through it that that certain bad actors have methods of control over a society, which does not necessarily mean that the society is in support of it. Sometimes they have no choice in the matter. In the same way as a drug cartel in Mexico or in Colombia controls a society and corrupts the army and the judiciary, and El Chapo Guzman is in jail now, but the way they established control was by framing, if you don't collaborate, they come and tell you, Senor, your niece Conchita, she's beautiful, studying law in university. You understand that they are threatening you, and you comply. And then they give you $1,000 in an envelope. You become part of the system, and if you don't, they kill you. And this is how bad actors establish a hegemony. It doesn't mean that there is support. It means that you want to liberate them from that bad actor as much as you want to liberate yourself. Especially that even if I don't care, let them go to hell and live with Hezbollah as much. I don't think that it is viable to have an order where such an actor still prevails, even in a small part of, because they have means of dragging everybody into the same. And they have means to do it. They have done it. The country has collapsed through constant battering, constant assassinations, constant state of war, constant smuggling. I think we're all victims of that. So that's the difference, I think. That's one of the sure. And I don't think I'm not anti-federalism. I'm for decentralization, and I'm for a very weak state and all this. Yeah. But I don't think it would resolve it to accept that bad actor by separating from it.
Very briefly.
Sure, of course. Yeah.
So the Hashd al-Shabi is a bad actor, what you're calling a bad actor in Iraq. I think Kurdistan and the Kurds are doing a good job at, to a large extent, protecting themselves from that bad actor. Mm-hmm. Assad regime is a bad actor in Syria. Mm-hmm. And I think the Kurds of Syria, feeble as they are, imperfect as they are, but they have carved a place for themselves in Syria, that they are relatively within, again, the imperfection of the situation, protecting themselves from the Assad regime. I believe some kind of confederal arrangement would give us also a kind of safe haven in this country, whereby just like the Kurds of Iraq that are relatively safe from the Hashd al-Shabi, we too can be safe from Hezbollah via the logic that I am suggesting. I don't see a solution. I don't see that happening within the confines of the logic that you are suggesting, Nadim.
Let me wrap it up. With the final thought. And I think what we're talking about, the reason we're here, the reason this debate happened, and the reason we're not agreeing is because there's a deep pain in Lebanon, and we're healing it in separate ways, which I think is natural. Nadim is holding on to something that he grew up with. It's fading today, but he still holds on to it. Hicham, you grew up in a way that I didn't know before until we spoke today. I didn't know your early years. And I think what you've seen happen to Lebanon is what I've seen happen to Lebanon too. Rawi Hajj, on that little scooter ride, speaking to him for almost 3 hours about Ashrafiyya. It's real. There is a problem. And anyone that suggests otherwise is misinformed. The Christians of Lebanon do not feel at home. That is true. Extinction is not an option. I don't think anyone on this stage is cheering on for one community to flee. I think we're just not seeing the solution.
It is an option if they commit suicide.
Let me wrap it up, though. Short of suicide, I fear that if the three of us weren't alive, the country could end up in divorce. And I think divorce requires war. And I think war hasn't happened yet because Hezbollah is in control. There's no competition like there was in the 1970s. The PLO had a fierce opposition that almost won the initial battles. Kataib was training in the 1970s. We don't have a viable militia-like force that's training, and idiots that suggest the Lebanese forces as a militia, they're the ones that are ideological. I think they're misinformed fundamentally. But later, if Hezbollah's security grip weakens, if the Syrians wiggle their way back in, if Lebanese parties do take up security measures, divorce could happen. And if that's the fait accompli, is our whole discussion tonight, this back and forth, is it perhaps acknowledging that at the end of the day, what is happening to this country is less identity and religion and more war? That we've been stuck in endless war for too long. Our lives, we have not lived in a normal Lebanon. Nadim grew up in a semi-functioning Lebanon. It wasn't perfect. Semi-functioning. I don't think I will ever live to see a normal Lebanon. But I may end up seeing divorce. And divorce to me hurts immensely. It's because even if I'm given a permit, or even if I have to move myself, or even for that matter, if I want to express myself fully, I'm letting go of myself. I'm letting go of everything that brought me to Lebanon. And that doesn't make me feel right. It makes me feel wrong, like I'm an imposter. So can you take anything from that and maybe express how you see divorce happening, if it's going to happen, and if partition or separation is a reality, what it could mean, not for the Christians of Lebanon, but for the rest? Could it be that we are left to deal with the rubble and the Christians of Lebanon move on?
I mean, first of all, let's make clear, I'm calling for federalism, not for divorce.
Of course.
I'm just talking about divorce to answer your question.
I meant it more like if that,
yeah. I mean, divorce could happen peacefully. I mean, in Czechoslovakia does not exist anymore, right? Because people voted to go their separate ways. So if we are going to think about divorce, one way to do divorce is not necessarily through war. Why not give every community the choice? Do you want to live in a united Lebanon, or do you want to have your own separate Lebanon? That's one way. I mean, if a community chooses to have its own country, then that's how divorce could happen. Would that be sad? I think what would be really sad was more violence. If divorce is the way to avoid more violence in the future, then no, divorce would not be sad. Again, I don't see the fact that Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots are no longer living in a united Cyprus. I don't see it as a tragedy. In my mind, that it would have been a tragedy had they been fighting one another over and over and over again. That would be a tragedy because people die that way. But the fact that you have, Muslim Turks living on one side of the island and Christian Greeks living on the other side of the island, and no wars, and everybody taking on it, I don't see that as a tragedy. In 1995, the Quebecois, the French minority in Canada, were given the choice to leave or to stay in Canada. 51% chose to stay, 49% chose to leave. Had it been the other way around, we would have ended up with a new country called Quebec. And I don't see why that would have been a disaster. So eventually, and again, I'm just answering your question. If we end up with no Lebanon, smaller Lebanons, but living peacefully, then that would not be a tragedy. The true tragedy, and this is what I fear most, and this, by the way, what may end up being the case, neither federalism nor divorce nor a functioning centralized state, nothing.
Paralysis until death.
Ad infinitum. And that could happen for years and years and decades. Remember Somalia, remember Yemen. I mean, I could think of case studies where you ended up in a country stuck in a kind of more or less civil war or dysfunctioning state for decades and decades and decades on end. And this, I mean, if we're talking about what would be truly sad, in my mind, that scenario would be the saddest scenario of all, and everything else is debatable.
Almost like a permanently failed state, where you have Puntland in Somalia, sort of this odd autonomous region, but it's not exactly shining.
I mean, I don't remember, so I cannot quote it 100%, but it's from Orwell, 1984. I think it says, I took a look at the future and it's somebody's foot that is marked on somebody's face, or something like that. I'm quoting that very badly. But I took a look at the future and it's just somebody's foot crushing the head of somebody else. This is how 1984 ends. I worry that this could be us. I mean, the country doesn't matter for anyone, really. I mean, the West doesn't really care about what's going on here. Iran is extremely powerful. It's likely to remain powerful for some time, at least. Syria is in chaos. Iraq is in chaos. The whole region is in flame. We can be stuck like that for years and years and decades, unless we carve a place within that chaos that would allow us to have some semblance of a life. And that's like Kurdistan. That's the example I'm really thinking about a lot lately. I mean, Iraq is still dysfunctioning. Iran is still very powerful. The Hashd al-Shabi is still there. But the Kurds are living somewhat decently.
This is in no way trying to play a trick on you. On the contrary, it's quoting you. That to you would be Mount Lebanon.
That to me would be some kind of free zone that is whose frontiers are yet to be defined, but that would be definitely free from Hezbollah, Amal, and anybody who supports Hezbollah and Amal. So that could be pretty much the rest of the country. That could be Mount Lebanon and Tripoli. That could be only Mount Lebanon, depending on what people want. I mean, I don't have an exact solution for this, but I do believe that it's time to think roughly along these lines. Sticking with the March 14th dream of a powerful, functioning, centralized state, that's an illusion. And this is where my anti-romanticism kicks in. That's an illusion. That's not going to happen. It's a dangerous way to think about things, and we need to put that behind us and start thinking along the lines that the Federalists are suggesting.
So the local solution, born from a local expression, there's no international engagement here. This is a Lebanese idea. It's borrowing from other examples which you described that are peaceful ways forward, not violent way forward. They're meant to alleviate. They're meant to bring more harmony. Everything that Hicham said, and adding to what I said earlier, which is the direction could be heading to partition and divorce, and also emphasizing that's not what Hicham is saying.
It is. I mean, he's talking about partition. He's calling it federalism. I mean, Kurdistan is partition. It's not federalism.
Kurdistan is not its own country. Iraq is the country.
The Kurds think of it as partition, and you shouldn't be ashamed of saying it's part. I'm saying the whole region is in a mess, and there has to be, because of certain bad actors, and the whole region could be a much better place, including Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Israel, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and Yemen and all that, the whole region could go into a much better place. And I unrealistically think that, in your words, Yani, we should think of that. And I also think that admitting that the region is going to be like this forever, and that we can carve ourselves a little enclave to live separately from it, is not realistic. And on top of that, half the people in that enclave are pro-Hezbollah. Yani the Aounists are pro-Hezbollah.
They're not.
You should hear them in their honeymoon talks, muqawama, and they don't even they look at the language, look at the how can these are political opinions. They're not ethnically or religiously determined political ideas. No, I have people in my family who are Aounists. Yani it's not, and they are pro-Hezbollah.
You have the final word.
You cannot live off. You cannot live separate. You cannot create an enclave in a swamp, and think we can survive without having at least the aspirations of making the region a better place, which a lot of people do, and a lot of people on every side, and we're not the only ones who want a better life.
See, the
Hicham, you have the
Thank
last
you.
word.
There's a dual problem with what you're suggesting. First of all, if the situation continues for another 30 years or 40 years, not a lot of the other communities will still be here. I mean, people are leaving in droves.
It's different.
You don't seem to take that into consideration, and I find that mind-blowing. So that's one thing. The other thing, again, I don't see what's so wrong about Kurdistan. I mean, in Kurdistan, the economy is doing relatively well. Obviously, there's the oil factor and all that. The security is doing relatively well. The Kurds are, they can go to school and learn in their own language, which is good and legitimate. So they have their own enclave within the confines of a dysfunctional state. And I don't see, what's so morally right or politically right. Let us say Kurdistan did not exist. Let us say the Kurds were not autonomous within Iraq, and they would be suffering just as like people in Basra are suffering right now. What's so good about that? I mean, what's so romantic? I mean, I don't see anything good about that. So yes, actually, you can have a kind of semi-functioning or somewhat functioning enclave within the confine of a dysfunctional state. And again, while that would be an imperfect solution for what we're going through, I would suggest to prefer imperfect solutions that are real, that could work. Rosy solutions that are basically, again, completely divorced from social reality, because they are built more in Arabic, there's a term which I like a lot, raghbawiyya. It comes from raghba. I have a raghba in seeing that happening, thus this is happening. I think raghbawiyya is a very, very dangerous way of looking at things. And I suggest we avoid it. I'll just end here.
It's the last word.
Let me bring it home.
Yeah.
I did 5 episodes this week alone.
Yeah.
So I speak a lot. I record a lot. I edit on my own. When MTV doesn't have help, I go and edit their episodes too. I'm exhausted. I think it's beginning to show. I'm actually taking a break in August for that reason. I haven't taken a break in years. 5 years. I'm taking the month off to lose some weight.
Yes.
And to stop looking at social media in particular.
If you managed, tell me how.
Oh, a friend took me to Mar Sharbal's cave. I'm thinking of that as a... Tauters doesn't deliver there, though. That's the only problem. I have to cook. Was it 30 years he went silent?
Who?
Mar Sharbal. I think 30 years. He's very inspiring for me right now. 20 years ago, thanks to Sarmad Salibi, I meet Kamal Salibi. 18 years ago, briefly introduced to Samir Asir. 3 nights ago, an author Rawi Haj, who writes brilliantly. And you know what? 3 Lebanese authors that are Christian. There isn't much going on here of a common thread. And I actually like that. And I like Sarmad Salibi for what he believes. I love Rawi Haj, the way he writes about Christian anxiety too, and his own identity. And I have to beg to differ on one thing. It's not illusion. It's my cause. If federalism is real, so was March 14. And I think this man paid an unfortunate price, not because he's Christian or Muslim. Those last words he wrote about the Beirut Spring shining if Damascus shines, meaning the Syrian regime is going to cost him his life. He was right. Hezbollah inheriting that destroyed Lebanon. And I think that's the message that I hold on to, which is I can't dishonor them. So that's my cause. This is the hardest episode I've ever done. In 5 years, I've never moderated a difficult debate. I've done debates before. Actually, I did a debate for May Shadiet. She puts an earpiece in your ear.
Who was on the other side?
Oh, the usual suspects. Yeah. And I found that to be nerve-wracking for technical reasons. Emotionally, mentally, this is the hardest episode I've ever done.
Wow.
Yeah. But that's why I do this, is because I do think none of us have the tools, unfortunately. Unless we're fighters, I don't think we are. Unless we aspire to violence, none of us do. Hezbollah is winning. And it's winning through those methods. And the peaceful thinkers are the ones that get killed first. And what's left is people like us who are not on their radar right now, who talk in a lovely setting like Hamdoun with a wonderful audience that I think stuck around. Who
are they still
listened
here?
Patiently. You guys were very kind with your time for coming up to Hamdoun.
Now I have to walk back to Beit Miri because...
I'll put you in the trunk. Do me a favor. If anyone took photos, if you're posting them, tag the 3 of us. And special credit to Sarmad Salibi for suggesting this. Round of applause to Sarmad. Check out Federal Lebanon on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. Check out Confucius on Twitter and Nadim Shehadi on Instagram and Facebook. I have to ask you both. We're well beyond our time. Well beyond our time. And it's late. Do you still have the energy to do a quick Q&A, or is it off the table?
Yeah.
No, of course.
You do?
It's not off the table.
Is the audience willing to stick around?
We have to see them.
Okay, let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll be back here for a Q&A. But please, the question's brief. We need to get home eventually. So 10-minute break, guys. Thank you.
They're still here. وين الشالوت؟
Yeah, beautiful.
تطلع فوق الشالوت بالدرج لفوق.
سانتر فيل.
ايه فوق على هيدا في محل كان محكمة درزية. هيدا بيتنا.
Gentlemen, we can actually hear your conversation.
Yes, that's good. Okay.
Right, so
Nothing to hide.
we're back, and it's
Is this work? Yeah.
Yes, it's a Q&A session now.
But can we see the audience?
There's a light showing on them, actually.
There's a light shining on them?
Yeah. Are there questions up front? Is that Sarah at the front?
Yes.
Sarah, you get the first question. Could you, just for the episode, introduce yourself? What you do and all that?
Hi, everyone. Ronnie, I really admire you. Thank you so much. Sarah Yassine, landscape architect, urbanist, faculty at AUB, USG, graduated from LSE, UPenn, Harvard, AUB. formerly candidate at Beirut 2nd District. My question and comment is in two parts. 1958, Camille Chamroun, but also Sami Salah, Sunni, Muslim, secular, feminist, who stood against the Nasserist. His house was burned in Basta Fawa, and his family was threatened. So I think this very minimalistic and very non-modern way of describing politics and sociologically understanding the different layers of the Lebanese society as a whole really troubles me today. From the generation of my parents, and Nadim, maybe you know them, I know of many Christians who were in Fatah, Christians from Haysarso, from Beirut. So I'm segue to the numbers of the voters turnout of the last elections from UNDP. Jnoub Wahad, so South 1, 49%, South 2nd, 51%, and South 3rd, 48%. So we have 50% who's not voting, despite the fatwa of Hassan Nasrallah, despite the threats, despite the money, despite the violence. So what does this 50% in this district think of? Adding to that I had access to voting schools in Beirut, and I was requested by Shia Beirutis from Khanda al-Ghamis al-Blat to go with them to vote for the Beirut al-Tahrir or other non-Shia, non-Hezbollah and Amal lists, because they were scared. Their parents were being threatened. They were being threatened by posts they had put on Facebook, Instagram. And these same people were our friends, either people we knew or people we had befriended during the October 17 movement, who were texting us, sending videos from Khanda al-Ghami saying, people coming down, beating people is not us because we're with you on the street.
Sorry, Sarah, just because I don't want to take too much more of their time. Just let's focus on the question. Yeah.
So the question is, I think, I don't think that federalism will solve Hezbollah. Federalism will make Hezbollah stronger. And I don't think Hezbollah will accept to a division or a federalist solution. And I think that we need to empower, and I said that to you, Ronnie, during our interview last year, we need to empower, encourage people who are like Luqman Slim and not isolate them and point fingers at them, because they are here, they exist. And I would like to say that to Nadim, I want the Senate. And a lot of us want to try the Senate. And a lot of us are secular from generations, and we have the right to exist, and we have the right to be represented.
Maybe we can start quickly over the Senate, Nadim, and then give Hicham.
But that's not the question. She just made a political statement.
Okay, there was no question in there then. Okay.
But she's talking about the Senate. I can tell her I'm the only sectarian in Lebanon. No, every person you talk to says that they are secular in Lebanon, including Nabih Berri and Wali Jumblat and General Aoun and everybody else. So I happen to be the only sectarian in Lebanon.
Okay, thank you for the statement.
I did not remove my religion from my Ikhraj aid, but I support everybody else to do it because my religion is okay. I'm Protestant.
Are there any questions? We can do the statements maybe after, but just are there questions? I can't really see, so if there's anyone.
I'm being your eyes.
Yeah.
Of course. Let's give credit to George Wardini, who helped me with the lights and the cameras. By the way, I'd like to plug him. He runs a page called Polyblog on Instagram.
Oh.
He produces a show called The Seha. I think we're both on Seha in different, And he was the producer of Serde for 2 months.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
I introduced you.
Yeah.
Sorry, my mic's not working. Hello, I'm gonna try to keep it as short as possible. My question is today, do you think if Hezbollah was not part of the equation, we would be having this conversation?
Is it for me?
Sure.
Absolutely, because remember, George, we had a civil war in 1958, 5,000 people died, and there was no Hezbollah there. The state surrendered to the Palestinians in 1969, and there was no Hezbollah there. The state surrendered again to the Palestinians in 1973 via the Melkart Accord, and there was no Hezbollah there. 1975 happened, and there was no Hezbollah. The War of the Mountain happened, there was no Hezbollah, etc., etc., etc. So the system have failed again and again and again before Hezbollah. And so we should have had a conversation about the system, decades ago, before even Hezbollah. So the short answer to your question is absolutely, on one hand. On the other hand, remember, Hezbollah is the product of the civil war, which itself happened under a centralized system of government. So we have to, even when we think about Hezbollah, we have to think, we have to link it to the form of government that we have. So absolutely, the short answer to your question is absolutely yes. And I think while thinking above anything else about Hezbollah, because it's like the elephant in the room, our political thinking about the Lebanese crisis should not be confined to Hezbollah. And we certainly should not think that if somehow magically Hezbollah disappears, everything will be okay, because everything was not okay even before Hezbollah existed.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that Hezbollah has outgrown the problems that have preceded it and allowed it to happen. So no, even if we were to reverse and go back in time and look at things, we cannot overcome the first obstacle that we have, which is the problem that became bigger than the problems that allowed it to happen. And I don't think that in any mathematical equation, because you love numbers, I do too, in any mathematical equation, if you change any number, if you change any sign, the entire result would be totally different, even if it was a small increment. So what about in our case, which is it's the biggest number in the equation? If it weren't there, I think the result would be entirely different. We should still be talking about the system, of course, but I don't think we would have to be talking about it with this level of desperation. I think we'd feel a lot more comfortable. Second of all, I don't agree. I watched you on Marcel Ghanem last week, and I saw that you made the conclusion that because 95% of the Shia voters voted for Hezbollah, then de facto they co-sign on Hezbollah's manifesto, which claims that Lebanon and the region must be ruled by Muslims because it belongs to Muslims. I think if you go back to the origins and the books of any ideology or religion in the world, you're going to find equally problematic things. But the people who adopt them today, including, I think, the teachings of the church and Christianity, I think the church has taught severely problematic things in its history. But people who practice Christianity today do not necessarily co-sign on these things. But I also think that people are voting for Hezbollah because, first of all, they don't have any other option. So I wholeheartedly agree with the entire narrative of Mr. Nadim in this. They تغطسوا بالسيستم لأنه ما في شيء براته, ما في alternative, and the people who try to create alternatives end up being dead or isolated or excluded. So I think Hezbollah without violence would only be a matter of time before the 5% turns into a 50%. Then I think without violence, it is the inevitable result. Hezbollah would not be able to continue to hold a grip. And if this weren't the case, Hezbollah would have given up their weapons a long time ago if they were able to simply with ideology and identity continue to hold a grip on power. Even the Iranians in Iran are refusing the ideology of the IRGC. And third of all, you acknowledge that identities are social constructs.
Yeah, of course.
So you said we cannot deconstruct already existing identities, but I think we can construct new ones that outgrow the old ones. We don't want to deconstruct sectarian identity. We want to construct a Lebanese identity that Lebanese people will behold above their sectarian identities. Thank you.
All excellent points. Let me begin with the last one, because I presume you seem to be looking at me.
Yes.
Okay, good. Again, let's go back to the comparative dimension of things. It's very easy to say that we can do this, we can do that. Theoretically, we can come up with, theories like that. Let's think empirically, okay? we're not the only country in the Middle East with multiple communities in it. So we can think from a comparative perspective. Did the Syrians do it? I mean, was the young Syrian state able to somehow come up with some kind of trans-communitarian Syrian nationalism that broke the divide line or transcended the divide line between Sunnis and Alawis or between Arabs and Kurds? I think the answer is no, because had this happened, we wouldn't have had the Syrian civil war. Was the Iraqi state capable of coming up with some kind of, again, new identity that transcended the Sunni-Shia divide line and the Arab-Kurdish divide line? The answer is also not at all. Was Cyprus capable or able to come up with something like you just suggested? The answer is also not at all. So again, George, it's very easy to say, this is raghbawiyya. This is what I call raghbawiyya. Anta targhab. You wish to see this happening. From an empirical perspective, if it failed to happen once and twice and 3 times and 4 times and 5, then it's time to basically look back, take a step back from what we want and start looking at facts for what they are, not for what we wish them to be. I can go beyond that. I honestly, because I keep thinking about societies where you had big numbers of Christians and Muslims anywhere in the world. Were they able to come up with some kind of nationalism that transcended the divide line between Christianity and Islam? I don't pretend that I have a full, list of such countries, but every single country I can think about with big numbers, significant numbers. I'm not talking about Muslims in the state, which are like maybe 3%, or Copts in Egypt, which are 5 or 6 or 7%. I'm talking about countries where you had big numbers of Christians and Muslims coexisting in the same land. What happens next? So I can think of ex-Yugoslavia. I can think of Sudan. I can think of Cyprus. I can think of Nigeria. I can think of Timor-Leste in Indonesia. I can think of Lebanon, obviously. And every single time, these societies were unable to do what you suggested they should do. We should take that into consideration. We should ask ourselves, if the people in Cyprus were unable to do it, if the people in Yugoslavia were unable to do it, if the people in Sudan were unable to do it, why should the Lebanese be able to do it? Are we smarter than everybody?
Because Lebanon is neither of those places, and it's a different time.
It's not a different time. We're talking about contemporary politics. I'm not talking about what happened in the Reconquista, for instance.
Yes.
I'm telling you about contemporary Cyprus, contemporary Yugoslavia, contemporary Timor-Leste. Timor-Leste, of course, is the Christian majority part of Indonesia that eventually became its own state because, they couldn't remain in Indonesia forever. Sudan, the Sudan became, you ended up with Sudan and South Sudan only a few years ago. Yugoslavia happened not like 300 years ago. So we're talking about our time and age, all these countries where you had Christianity and Islam coexisting. The story does not end well. Actually, what's going on in France as we speak is also to a certain extent part of that story. Again, this is not a rosy thing to say. This is not a romantic thing to say, but it is what it is. And this is how I understand political analysis.
Before we get to you, Nadim, Hicham, could you comment on the reference to Iran? I think that was a question in there.
Yeah.
Can you just say it quickly?
I was saying that even Iranians in Iran are refusing to live by this ideological, religious...
I think this is where the comparison does not stand, because in Iran, you don't have the friction between Shia and Christians and between Shia and Sunnis in equal numbers. Here, the communitarian dimension makes things more complicated. I think, George, what you're not taking into consideration is this. For most Shia, this is their interpretation of history. Under the Ottoman Empire, they were despised because they were non-Sunnis. And by the way, that's mostly true, especially if you study 19th century Shia history. Due to the conflict between the Ottomans and the Safavid, the Arab Shia suffered a lot because from an Ottoman perspective, they were considered to be like a kind of Trojan horse. So while the Shia were never, pampered under the Ottomans, But in the 19th century, they were especially suffering. So from a Shia perspective, especially from an Amili Shia perspective, when the Sunnis were in control, we were despised. And then when the Maronites came, they controlled the economy, they controlled the state, and we were basically also despised. Now it's payback time. Now it's our time to control the state. And if we can do that via Hezbollah, then we will do that via Hezbollah. That's not something that you seem to be taking into consideration.
No, but do you presume that every single Shia person is ideological to that extent?
No, I didn't tell you ever. I'm very careful. I'm saying a large majority, which is the majority that voted for Hezbollah. No community at all. I mean, if somebody that has not a PhD, not a master's degree, if somebody that has a BA degree in political science tells you that any group operates 100% the same way, I mean, he shouldn't be having that debate. That being said, you do have general trends. You do have large majorities sometimes within group, and I think the large majority of the Shia community is operating within these ideological confines and interpretation of history that I just told you about.
Yes, and I think this large majority would slowly let go of this narrative without the factor of
How
Hezbollah.
do you know that?
Because time moves forward, it doesn't move backwards.
What do you mean? I mean, ISIS just recreated the caliphate just like 5 years ago. What do you mean time?
Yes, but these Lebanese people are not terrorists. They are Lebanese
No,
citizens.
I'm not, Azizi.
Yes.
I'm not telling you they are terrorists. I'm objecting to your interpretation.
You have 2 more Azizis before you pay for our drinks. Oh, this was the time. Are we allowed to start using the Azizi only?
Of course. I'm objecting to your interpretation of history as this is what we call determinism historique. As if you're assuming there's like just one way and that's the way forward and history moves forward. I think of history as cycles. You know, I mean, we can be, for instance, let me give you one especially relevant example today. Who would have thought in the 1950s that the extreme right in Europe would again be a thing? I mean, Le Pen was getting 0.5. Listen to this. Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father of Marine Le Pen, was getting something like 0.5% of the vote.
I voted for him.
Okay. Now they're getting the extreme right. I mean, it's still getting 40%. Europe is back to a place only 60 years after Hitler where you have solid extreme right in Germany, solid extreme right in France,
but
etc.
it's been diluted.
Which goes to show that there's no just a single direction of history.
Yes,
and
I
it's
agree.
going in, you see what I mean?
I agree, but what constitutes extreme 40 years ago is not what constitutes extreme today, and it's the same. In Italy, Meloni wants to safeguard the same-sex civil couple marriage. ماشي الحال. This is not the same right wing of 40 years ago. Extremes shrink; they become less. They're extreme today, but they're way less extreme than what they were 50 years ago.
Absolutely, and the conservative right in Germany before Hitler was also less extreme than Hitler, and we still ended up with Hitler, which goes back to what exactly the point I'm trying to make. There's not a single direction of history, and we can be absolutely certain that if the Shia now are voting for Hezbollah, 30 years they will not be voting for Hezbollah. Yep. A majority of Alawi, in my mind, were supporters of the Assad regime in the 1980s, and the majority of Alawi today, 50 years later, are still supporters of the Alawi regime. For the life of me, I don't know why that cannot happen. I mean, I don't know how you can be certain.
You're right. Let's just hope we're all on the same side of history then.
Could I play with George's question and offer the other comparison of a...
I'm sorry for being so gloomy. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I wanted to just play with that question just a bit. Yeah. I've done several episodes. Nadim was actually a guest on one of them. He was part of a panel on the Northern Ireland experience with the IRA.
Yeah.
With Drew Mkhayil.
Oh, yeah.
8 episodes or 7 episodes. The framework for that episode was that you can have IRA having something like 90% of the Catholic base supporting them, and you can have something like 80% or even more voting for Sinn Féin, which is the political party that emerged. Is that kind of an acceptable trajectory for what you're saying, George? In other words, Hezbollah stays. Hezbollah is a party, but it's not the same party. Like Sinn Féin is not IRA today.
There is a big difference. There's a big difference, and this is very relevant to your federalism idea. The difference between Bosnia and Ireland and Lebanon is that size matters in Bosnia and Ireland. They do the power sharing according to voting size. So if you vote more Catholics in, the Catholics have more share in power, and it's the same in Bosnia. They voted for separation, which is similar to the federalism you're talking about.
Yeah.
In Lebanon, it's a completely different. It doesn't depend on numbers. It's power sharing in the abstract, where size does not matter in that. And I've been in meetings in Sarajevo where Sarajevians were saying, "This is not us. This is how the West, after killing themselves for each other for hundreds of years, conceived of societies in Westphalia and in Augsburg and places like that, and they're coming to impose it on us, to have separate communities living in separate lives and voting in separate. But that's not us, because historically, for hundreds of years, we've lived together, and that. So small episodes of do not color the
small episodes where tens of thousands of people get slaughtered.
No, I want
minus the small detail, everything is perfect.
But you see, when you go to next time you go to Cyprus, go to the Turkish part.
I did.
The Turkish Cypriots.
I lived there for a year.
The Turkish Cypriots hate the Turks. They call them the Anatolians. And they consider themselves the losers in this equation, because they've been condemned to live with their fellow Turks, whereas they're used to living in a diverse society with the Greeks. The Greeks are less of losers, but you should ask that. In the same way, in Lebanon,
I think there's actually more Turkish citizens in northern Cyprus today than Turkish Cypriot citizens.
Of course, yes, they've been driven out. And in Lebanon, don't ask the Christians. Ask the Muslims. The Muslims are more keen on the Christians staying than the Christians themselves are keen on staying. And I've experienced this. I've once organized a meeting during the Civil War between an MP and an academic. The academic was Christian and was telling the Sunni MP, "You have to understand our fears. We, the Christians, are afraid of fundamentalist Islam." And the MP told him, "You are afraid of fundamentalist Islam? I am far more afraid of fundamentalist Islam. And the reason why I want you to stay with me is because you are the only protection against such fundamentalism."
So would you allow me to put what you just said to the test?
Yes.
Okay. So when you say the Muslims want the Christians to stay in Lebanon, let's put that to the political test. So what the Christians want above anything else is for Lebanon to remain as much as possible away from the conflicts of the region. That, supposedly at least, that was the Mithaq al-Watani, la sharq wa la gharb. That was the deal. The Christians would accept that the French would leave. In exchange, the Muslims would accept the finality of Lebanon as an entity, and la sharq wa la gharb. Okay. Yeah. So that was supposed to be the deal in the 1940s. In the 1950s, Nasserism became a thing, and you had the UAR, the United Arab Republic. If the Muslims truly wanted the Christians to feel at home, all right, they shouldn't have been so keen on aligning themselves with Nasser. In fact, Nasserism, the moment Nasserism became a thing in the region, it became a thing within Muslims in Lebanon, and suddenly you ended up with the new slogan, not La Sharq wa La Gharb, if you remember, Badna al-Wahda, Bakir Bakir, Maha al-Asmar Abd al-Nasir. How does that translate into...
It translates into mukhabarat being clever.
No, not mukhabarat. See, don't put it on the mukhabarat. Nasserism, hundreds of thousands, millions of Arabs everywhere identified with Nasser, including hundreds of thousands of Muslims in this country. Yeah. So let me put to what you said to the empirical test. So in 1969, the Christians did not want the PLO to become a state within the state, right?
No.
No, they did not want it.
The Christians made the Cairo Agreement was made by the Christians, not by the Muslims.
No, that's not true.
The Cairo Agreement
Rashid Karami boycotted the state for 7 months until the Lebanese state went on its knees and basically surrendered to the PLO. And then again, what I'm saying is not on the level of the elite. I'm talking about, because the example you said, an ordinary Muslim just told the ordinary Christian, whoever. The point is, the popular base of the PLO in Lebanon was not in Kisarwain, was not in Bsharri. The popular base was among Lebanese Muslims. So again, let me put what you just said to the test. If truly they wanted Christians to feel at home, why did they support the PLO, which led to the Lebanese state surrendering to the PLO? I can continue again. Communism in the 1970s became a thing in Iran. Automatically, not all Muslims obviously, but enough Muslims imported communism in Lebanon, and here we are. What I'm trying to say, every time you had some kind of illiberal ideology appearing in the region, whether it be Nasser, whether it be Arafatism, whether it be communism, automatically it becomes a thing in Lebanon via one sector of Lebanese Islam or another. That makes living in this country impossible for the Christians. So please don't tell me that they want you to stay. That's simply, if you want me to stay, I need to stay comfortable in this country. I cannot be comfortable with Nasser. I cannot be comfortable with Arafat. I cannot be comfortable while surrendering the sovereignty in Lebanon for the PLO. I cannot be comfortable with Khomeinism. So forgive me. This is what you're saying again. This is what I call, and I don't mean it in a disrespectful way. This is what I call political romanticism, which I reject in favor of historical empiricism.
You see, when there are strong regional movements, the minority that follow it take control. In Europe, there are these strong Christian movements like Orban, Christian Nationalist Movement, Orban. And in Lebanon, we are, in a way, you are, and so is Jubran Basil and others, riding that wave.
Don't put me on the same.
You are. I'm sorry, but you are in the same boat. In the same boat. You are in the same boat as Jubran Basil, and you'll have to share with him. And you'll have to share with him.
I'll vote against him. That's fine.
The power
vote against him anyway.
And he will use Hezbollah against you you see, when there are illiberal, the illiberal movements, even if they are a minority, they gain control very quickly in a homogeneous society.
Aziza, you're missing. That's another Aziza.
No. After 11, it's double.
Okay.
Everyone gets 2 glasses.
You're missing the point. You said Muslims want Christians to remain.
Yes.
Okay, for that to be true, there are some political conditions to be met, and I don't see them being met. So it's easy to say that, you know, but it doesn't matter. I mean, words do not matter. What matters is facts, political behavior. Political behavior systematically is creating conditions that basically are inconvenient for the future of Christian presence in this country.
So now you think that because you're going back to that the majority of the Shia want Hezbollah?
A majority of Sunnis accepted.
Accept what?
The Hurriyat al-Amal al-Fidai. Well, that created conditions in Lebanon, security conditions, political conditions.
Can I tell you how many Christian ministers in the government in the last 15 years were active members of the PLO?
Aziz, it doesn't matter. It does not matter. I'm not saying every single Muslim is like that or every single Christian.
Because you're talking about 2 different periods. You see, in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't religious.
It's not religious today. I mean, that's a completely different debate, by the way. When I talk about sex, I'm talking about social identities. You can be perfectly atheist and be communitarian. Adolf Hitler was completely atheist, but he hated the Jews. Anti-Semitism, speaking of that, began as a religious quarrel between Christian and Jews. Eventually, it evolved into a racial ideology that you could be somebody completely atheist and yet hate the Jews. I make a big difference between religion and communitarian identities. What I'm talking about is communitarian identity, not religion. But
let me see if there's anyone that has any other question. Samer, maybe we can give it to. Is there anyone?
I have one. Right.
Okay,
Hi.
please. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so this is me.
Can you just introduce yourself?
Oh, yes. Hi, my name is Maisa. This is me speaking strictly from, being born in the U.S., growing up in the U.S., and experiencing federalism over there as it is. We have 50 states and then a federal government. And it's that system seems to be working over there. However, we can't compare it to here because, in the U.S., there's the idea of the separation of church and state,
Sure.
which we do not have here. So I guess earlier, sorry, let me pull up my question. When it was said, that federalism was described as an imperfect solution that is real and can work, can it actually work here, given the fact that there is no separation of church and state?
There is. I'm sorry, but Lebanon has much more separation of church and state than any other country. It is in fact unique in not only in the Arab world, even in Europe. We have complete separation because we don't have civil status laws. It's separation of churches and state, and each church is free to practice its own canon when it comes to marriage and civil matters like inheritance and death and so we are the most secular society in the world, probably after India, maybe.
I'm going to actually interject this time. So yes, the civil status thing, Ana hon, right in front of you. The civil status thing is actually somebody like me, an atheist or a secularist, real secularist. What law do I follow? Whose church, whose mosque, whose whatever dictates my status?
Under federalism, you mean?
Under just federalism, under this so-called secular state that we're living in.
I don't think we are living in a secular state. I think officially in the Constitution, so it doesn't say Islam is a religion of the state or Christianity is a religion of the state, and that sets us apart from the Arab world. But at the same time, we don't have civil marriage. Right?
Civil marriage is not secular.
I'm sorry?
Civil marriage is not separation of church and state. Civil marriage is the hegemony of the state over the church.
I mean,
in Lebanon, a unified civil marriage law would be the state imposing a law on all the other religion, on all the churches, which is not separation.
But
I think Hicham was answering more where does someone like Samer fit in?
Samer mean?
The audio engineer. Yeah.
the audio guy. انت قرر ومنلاقي لك عريس، لاقي العروس ومندبرك العروس. انت بس اعتمد ولا يهمك.
لا man, I come from a very 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 mixed background, by the way. Like الوفاء الوطني عايش فيه.
Okay.
Guys, are there any other questions? Just we can take just a few more. Could you say who you are, what you do?
Hello. My name is Hassan Mirai. I'm an entrepreneur, artist, and activist since 2019. I'd like to ask Mr. Hicham, your numbers about the majority of Shia is voting for Hezbollah. You said 95%. Where it's coming from?
Okay, so Jean Akhoul, who's an expert on elections. Maybe you've seen him on TV. He wrote a very good book called انتخابات 2022 الديمقراطية المؤجلة. So he analyzed the votes of every sect in numbers. So if you go to page 205, صفحة 205, he mentions the numbers pertaining to the Shia. I didn't say that 95% voted for Hezbollah alone. Actually, من أصل So out of 562, I think Hezbollah got something like 350. So a bit more than 50%. But I did say that
Majority of Shia.
Hezbollah and allies. So if you count Hezbollah, Harakat Amal,
yes.
and the other so that accounts to more than 95%.
Yeah, 95% of the 49% that voted.
Yeah, but
51% of the voters, they didn't vote because they are victims. And
they had no
didn't
choice.
They didn't go to vote.
Wait, so this is okay. I see your point.
And out of the 49%, you don't know what kind of situations they are when they go to votes. Like myself, I went to vote and I was pants. I was looking at Hezbollah members on the street holding guns with big beards, and I was thinking that someone has a camera over my head when I vote to someone else than Hezbollah. So the threat was real, and if I am going to take all these people into a federal state, I'm telling them, listen, guys, you sort out your. I don't know what to do with you. And
okay. I see your point.
Yeah.
Let's
Thank you so
it.
much.
No, you're welcome.
Wait,
so to go back to your first question, that's a book that I suggest
But you have to be with us.
you read, because it's really professional work. Again, John Achoul, انتخابات 2022 الديمقراطية المؤجلة. Go to page 205 and you'll get the 95% number that I'm citing. That's one. Second, if you look at most elections, typically the ratio of people voting is somewhere between 47, 48 to 52, 53, 54, something like that. So the fact that 49 or almost 50% of Shia voted, that's not an unusual number. This is the usual ratio of people who vote.
It's a high ratio.
It's actually slightly higher than other, so it's not a low ratio. This is what I'm trying to say. Third,
in Iraq, it was like 12 to 15%.
Far less.
That was much more of a rejection vote.
Yeah. So Hassan, that's a good ratio. That's a legitimate ratio, 50% voting. That's not the majority. The majority, you never have like 90%. No, I said the majority of Shia who voted. So 95% of Shia voters indeed voted for Hezbollah and Harakat Amal.
Because there was no choice.
So three, that's actually not true that there was no choice. For instance, one of the most impressive candidates in the elections happened to be, in my mind at least, a guy called Ali Khalifa. Who's a Shia opponent of Hezbollah, a left-wing Shia opponent of Hezbollah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, yes, مزبوط. I was rooting for him with all my heart. Obviously, I don't vote there, so it doesn't matter. In my mind, he represented a very, very powerful alternative. And he, unfortunately, the number of votes he got, unfortunately, is ridiculous. So it's simply not true that there was no alternative. There was an alternative, but people. So wait, I'm trying to answer one myth. What I find a myth. So the first myth is that 50% is nothing. 50% is actually a very acceptable ratio of vote. The second misconception is there was no alternative. There was an alternative, and people did not vote for it. And the third, in my mind, false analysis that people are making when it comes to this. The 50% who did not vote didn't do that because they oppose Hezbollah. How do we know? Maybe they didn't vote because they couldn't care less about politics, because they prefer to spend time on the beach. We have people who are completely depoliticized. Maybe they didn't vote because they are so certain that Hezbollah is going to win that, they didn't bother go. Maybe because they were scared. So, perhaps all these things combined. But, to say that 50% who didn't vote automatically equates to half of the Shia opposing Hezbollah. Again, from an analytical perspective, it's highly problematic.
So sorry, guys. Sarmad gave me the sign. I think we need to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Maybe just one more question, and then
Because
we
the food
can.
is ready.
And is there somebody in the back that had a question?
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Just
my
introduce
name
yourself, please.
my name is Zina, and I'm a lawyer as well. So زميلة لإلك. I have a I have a question. This is a wonderful podcast. يعطيكم العافية.
Thank
It's
you.
amazing, really, and like being here on a Saturday night. It's just fascinating. I have a question regarding like the idea, just entertaining the idea of federalism.
Yeah.
When I hear you out trying to think about like what could be a durable kind of solution, I hear you out thinking about like each community or each sect as a sect, but I do not hear really the nuances.
Forgive me?
The nuances and what happens with the dynamics within the sects. And I do not also hear the very, very basic right, the fundamental right of self-determination of people who are not painted all in one color within these communities. So how does the imaginary kind of exercise work out for people who are not similar? It's not like every experience within the community is one community.
No, of course.
The second, the second thought that I have, which is I'll bundle them up, like the three questions.
Let me answer one after the other.
I'll give you the three and then you wrap it up.
You know what? Could you just ask one question? Because I think Sarmad really
the
wants
question,
us-
really, the question is, how can we think of federalism that really takes into account the needs and the priorities of the people? And then the idea is it's a futuristic idea. So how do you factor in the needs and the priorities of the young generation and where Lebanon is going to be? And the very super direct question now is, where do Palestinians fit in this cantonization of federalism?
Okay. طيب. Let me begin with the rights of the people. One reason why I am so enthusiastic about federalism, it's because in my mind it empowers ordinary people, whereas the central state puts all the power within an elite that rules the country from Beirut, and it's very difficult for people out in the regions to have any say in the decisions that affect their life. I'll give you an example. Let us say that the Minister of Education belongs to Harakat Amal. And let us say that you are an ordinary citizen in Tripoli. And you find that the public educational sector in Tripoli is crumbling, okay? What leeway do you have as someone from Tripoli over a minister whose power base is in the south? Answer, zero. By contrast, had we had federalism and you have actually a government in Tripoli that is handling the educational sector in Tripoli, then as someone from Tripoli, you'll have far more leeway putting that government to the test than putting Harakat Amal to the test. Because guess what? Harakat Amal could not care less about Tripoli, just as Wadi Jumblat power base is not dependent on how people in Sharri feel about things. And Samir Jaja can go all his life without caring about how people in Tyr are living, etc., etc. That's the centralized system for you. What I'm imagining is breaking this up and basically taking power from the center and giving it to the people in the regions. And so that I hope that I answered that dimension of your question. Now, for what would happen for secular people within nothing absolutely will happen. Imagine you are currently a member of the SSNP, الحزب السوري القومي الاجتماعي. That's as secular as it gets. You can still, run to the المقعد الماروني في بشري. I mean, secular parties can still field candidates to المقعد الشيعي in whatever, جبيل, بنت جبيل. The same thing would happen to when you have federalism. Let us say that Kasserwain is a canton, and then you have the Lebanese forces versus some kind of new liberal secular party. If the new liberal secular party wins, then they will be in control of the local government. And what's the big deal? I don't see why should that be an obstacle or an issue. And finally, for the intra sectarian dynamics, I think you mentioned that as well. What would happen to, I mean, currently you have, let us say, the Lebanese forces and the Tayyar Aouni competing for who has more seats in the Matan. Okay, why would it be problematic if they were competing under a federal arrangement for who has more MPs in the Matan and who's also the governor of the Matan? If it could happen now, it could happen after. So I don't see, I understand your questions, but I don't see that as an obstacle to federalism. If anything, especially the first point, if anything, federalism disempowers the ruling elite and gives power to ordinary people, which is what I presume we all want. Now, when it comes to the Palestinians, what would happen to them, or to the Syrians for that matter? Yeah, I mean, you could imagine a system in which every canton would vote that I would accept, let us say, 5% of non-Lebanese population on my territory.
Why would you fragment them, not canton them?
Because the very logic of federalism. No, that's fine. And the very logic of federalism is that most decisions are not taken on the central level; they are taken on the local level. So I would imagine also, if in a hypothetical scenario, if Lebanon becomes a federal state, Kisrawen can decide that I can agree, for instance, 10% of the level of the population. Let us say there is 500,000 people living there. I can accept 50,000 refugees. Another state could say, no, I accept 25,000. Another state could accept 100,000. Then these will be decided on a local level democratically. Why not?
Nadim, did you want to say anything before I wrap it up?
No, I think Sarmad will be very unhappy.
He'll be unhappy? Yes. Okay, so I have permission to wind it down?
Absolutely, Azizi.
From my side, I think that, Hicham, what you said throughout the episode about the reasons you advocate for federalism, beneath that, there's some truth in that. The more you battle Hezbollah in Lebanon, the fewer Christians you have, and the fewer Muslims too. And all types of denominations are killed by that group on the way. Whether it's Samir Asir, or more recently Luqman Slim, or everyone in between, and before, and probably after. So the security challenge has destroyed Lebanon, and all its communities too. And I don't think that is an excuse to ignore Christian uncertainty. Christian uncertainty has to be talked about. I'm glad you're talking about it regularly. I'm actually learning about federalism more than I ever would have imagined, because the way you talk about it day in, day out, and the beliefs you have, they're resonating. Whether it's in private conversations, on TV shows, in this difficult format, but I think this is the right way to talk about it, because we spent 3 hours. And an audience stayed 4 hours?
No, it's
about 3.5 maybe.
It's 5 to midnight.
Or maybe approaching 4. This is the longest conversation I've ever done. So there's a lot of rich texture. And this is our third exchange together. For anyone that didn't watch our exchange on MTV, I highly recommend it. I thought that was a brilliant way of discussing difficult terrain. So I want to thank you.
Thank you.
For believing in what you believe in, and in many ways teaching us too on the way. I'm learning. Nadim, I'm glad you're in this country. I'm glad you're not in Boston or looking for a job elsewhere. You were in New York, it didn't suit you, I'm sorry. I walked with you in Central Park. I walked with Nadim during Corona. Actually, I almost worked for Nadim at LAU.
Yeah.
And I think, Nadim, you forgot to send me the contract and you quit LAU. Typical Nadim shit. So then I left too.
I quit the whole estate.
You quit the whole country, and then I found you here. It makes more sense. You need to stay here, because if I can think of the best messengers for these different ideas, it's you too. Both of you. I learn from you, I detached myself from words I used to think negatively about. I put them at a healthy distance, and 500 episodes, I think you're the backbone for the podcast. So I look forward to more exchanges. Let me give a small shout out to George Wardini. This gentleman woke up in Ihden at 7 in the morning or so, 8 in the morning. He slept there at 5 in the morning last night. So he's functioning on 3 hours. He found his ride back down to the coast, and then he fell asleep by accident in Halet. And then he woke up right at time to help me bring these lights, to help set up the cameras. He's the best digital media producer in Lebanon today. Let me plug Sarmad Salibi. 2 decades of friendship. I don't know if his mother is still here, Wadad. Maybe she's up having dinner. Wadad, I haven't seen Sarmad's mom in many, many years. She looks terrific. So it's great to see her. Great to do this in Iris Domain. Thank you for making this the most difficult and most special episode I've ever done. So,
Can I have 3 seconds? Is this working?
It's working.
Yeah. Your experience in the last... So this is... your experience in the last 3 years...
5 years.
5 years. It would be a crime for you not to take 6 months off somewhere in a academic environment or in a nice environment like Bellagio or somewhere, and to distill everything you've learned from it, because you are in a unique position to have spoken to all these people during the revolution, before the revolution, after the revolution. And I admire the way you can handle people you totally disagree with. In a lot of, you know how I mean, not him, not Azizak, yeah, and it would be a treasure for if you manage to sit down and distill all this information into a manageable 200-page book for people who cannot listen to 700 hours of podcast.
Are you offering your home in Greece?
Ahlan wa sahlan, yes.
But what if I spend 6 months there and I come out a Federalist? Then the whole journey brought
I want
me
my
here.
money back.
Thank you, Sarmad. Thank you, George. Thank you, Samer, wherever Samer is. Thank you for doing this. You're terrific. Thank you to the audience. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening and watching, and a friendly reminder to support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box. Until next time, I'm Rani Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.